Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the shadowed corridors of history's most sacred spaces, temples, shrines, and holy sanctuaries, where the line between divine service and human corruption blurred into something the ancient world whispered about but rarely wrote down. You're about to discover that behind the incense smoke and chanted prayers, some of the most trusted spiritual leaders weren't just bending the rules, they were shattering them in ways that would make modern scandals look tame by comparison. Picture yourself standing before a towering ziggurat in ancient Mesopotamia around 2400 BCE. The sun beats down on mud brick walls as you watch pilgrims climb the steep steps, clutching offerings of barley and wine. They believe the gods literally live here, that priests serve as the only bridge between heaven and earth. But what if I told you that inside those sacred chambers, transactions were taking place that had very little to do with prayer? The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like why ancient texts sometimes describe temples as both the holiest and most morally questionable places in their cities. So before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below. But make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, or share what historical mystery fascinates you most. Your thoughts create a community here, and I read every single one. Now let's keep the lights as soft as possible. Turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You're walking through the streets of Uruk, one of the world's first cities, where the Temple of Inanna rises above everything else. Inanna, goddess of love, war, and fertility, demands worship that's unlike anything monotheistic religions would later imagine. Here, the sacred and the sensual aren't opposites. They're intertwined like the two snakes on a healer's staff. The priestesses who serve Inanna don't just pray, they embody the goddess's earthly power through rituals that involve their bodies as much as their spirits. The practice scholars call sacred prostitution, or temple prostitution, begins here in these Sumerian city-states. You watch as men from across the region arrive at temple gates, seeking blessings for their crops, their marriages, their futures. The donation they leave isn't just silver or grain. It's participation in a ritual act with a temple priestess, believed to channel the goddess's creative energy into the world. The Greek historian Herodotus will later write about this custom with a mixture of fascination and judgment, describing how every Babylonian woman was required to sit in the temple of Aphrodite once in her life and accept a stranger's coin for a sacred encounter. But historians still argue whether Herodotus got the story right, or sensationalized what he saw. Some modern scholars suggest that what ancient Greeks interpreted as prostitution was actually a more complex fertility ritual performed only by dedicated priestesses, not ordinary citizens. The truth probably sits somewhere in the muddy middle. Some temples did maintain this practice, while others might have been misunderstood by foreign observers who couldn't grasp how different cultures viewed sexuality and the sacred. You notice something else as you observe temple life. The priests here wield enormous economic power. Temples aren't just worship centers. They're the ancient world's first corporations controlling vast agricultural lands, employing hundreds of workers, and functioning as banks where citizens deposit valuables for safekeeping. A corrupt priest doesn't need to steal from the offering bowl. He can simply manipulate the temple's grain distribution, shortchange workers, or demand extra donations from desperate families seeking divine intervention for sick children. In one temple archive, preserved on clay tablets for over 4,000 years, you find records of a scandal. A high priest named Dudu was accused of enriching himself by claiming certain lands belonged to the temple when they actually belonged to private citizens. He'd forge documentation, intimidate witnesses, and use his religious authority to make people believe that opposing him meant opposing the gods themselves. When he was finally caught, probably because he angered someone more powerful than himself, the punishment was surprisingly light. Religious authorities didn't want the scandal to undermine faith in the entire temple system, so they quietly transferred him to another city. Sound familiar? The Mesopotamian temples also invented something we'd recognize today: the religious dynasty. You discover that prestigious priestly positions passed from father to son, creating families that controlled spiritual power for generations. These priest families intermarried with royal families, blending political and religious authority until they were nearly indistinguishable. A young man born into one of these families didn't need genuine spiritual calling or moral character, just the right last name. Some of the worst abuses came from these entitled second and third generation priests who'd never known life outside the temple walls and viewed commoners as resources to be exploited rather than souls to be served. Here's something quirky. Priests in some Mesopotamian temples had to follow bizarre purity laws that make modern religious restrictions seem reasonable. They couldn't eat garlic, touch pigs, or wear wool, only linen. They shaved their entire bodies every few days. Yet these same priests, so concerned with external purity, sometimes committed fraud, extortion, and abuse behind closed doors. The contradiction would have been darkly funny if it weren't so harmful. One ancient proverb that's survived goes, "A temple can be pure in the morning and polluted by evening," suggesting that even ancient people recognized the gap between religious appearance and reality. You're beginning to see a pattern that will repeat throughout history. Wherever religious figures hold power over people's spiritual well-being, some will inevitably abuse that power. The ancient world had no separation of church and state, no investigative journalism, no social media to expose hypocrisy. If a priest told you the gods were angry because you didn't donate enough, who were you to argue? If a priestess said a ritual required something that made you uncomfortable, how could you refuse without risking divine punishment? As you stand in that Mesopotamian twilight, watching priests close the temple gates for the night, you realize this is just the beginning. The scandals you're about to uncover span continents and millennia, involving some of history's most revered religious traditions. But they all share common threads: power, secrecy, and the dangerous assumption that being close to the divine makes someone immune to human corruption. The architectural design of these temples tells its own story about power and control. You notice how the innermost sanctuaries, where the most important rituals supposedly take place, are accessible only to the highest-ranking priests. Ordinary worshippers never see what happens in those dark chambers. They rely entirely on the priest's word about what the gods want, what the omens mean, what offerings are required. This information asymmetry creates the perfect environment for manipulation. In the Temple of Enlil at Nippur, you discover records of a practice that would make any modern auditor nervous. Priests kept 3 different sets of account books. One showed the temple's actual wealth, one showed what they reported to royal tax collectors, and one showed what they told donors about how contributions were used. The gaps between these books represented pure profit for corrupt temple administrators. When a farming family donated their best lamb, believing it would be sacrificed to ensure good harvests, that lamb might actually end up at a priest's private dinner party, while a sick, cheap replacement was burned on the altar. The sexual rituals, meanwhile, created another avenue for exploitation. While some priestesses may have genuinely believed they were channeling divine energy, others found themselves trapped in a system they couldn't escape. Young girls were sometimes dedicated to temples by poor families who couldn't afford to feed another mouth, essentially sold into religious service before they were old enough to consent. Once inside the temple hierarchy, leaving wasn't really an option. Where would a woman marked as a holy prostitute go in a society where reputation meant everything? You also discover that not all ancient societies practiced these rituals. The Hebrew Bible contains explicit prohibitions against temple prostitution, suggesting that Israelite religious reformers were deliberately rejecting Mesopotamian practices. The Book of Deuteronomy warns, "There shall be no cult prostitute among the daughters of Israel, neither shall there be a cult prostitute among the sons of Israel." This tells you two things. The practice existed in neighbouring cultures, and it was controversial even in the ancient world. As night falls completely over ancient Uruk, you watch a young priestess climb the ziggurat steps alone. Is she going to commune with the goddess in genuine spiritual devotion? Is she meeting a priest who's been manipulating her for months? Is she preparing for a ritual she believes in, or one she endures? From this distance, across thousands of years, you can't know her truth. But you know that her temple, like so many others, held both the sacred and the scandalous within its walls, and that the people who came seeking gods sometimes found only the worst of humanity instead. You're standing at the Ishtar Gate now, its blue-glazed bricks gleaming under the Babylonian sun around 580 BCE. Lions and dragons parade across the surface in yellow and white relief, symbols of gods and power. This is the formal entrance to Inner Babylon, the route that leads to the temple of Ishtar herself, and you're about to discover why Greek travellers returned home with stories that their own countrymen barely believed. Ishtar's temple complex sprawls across several city blocks, a religious institution so wealthy it functions as Babylon's economic heart. You watch as merchants deposit silver in the temple treasury, as scribes record loans made in the goddess's name, as farmers deliver their tithes of dates and barley. But the temple's most controversial service happens in chambers that outsiders rarely see, and when they do, they struggle to understand what they're witnessing. The historian Herodotus visits Babylon around 450 BCE, decades after the gate's construction, and what he observes shocks him. He writes that every Babylonian woman, regardless of social class, must once in her lifetime sit in the temple precinct and wait for a stranger to throw silver coins into her lap. Only then can she perform the sacred act with him and fulfill her religious obligation to the goddess. The wealthy women, he notes, arrive in covered carriages and leave quickly. The plain or poor ones sometimes wait for years. But here's where it gets complicated. Historians still argue whether Herodotus was reporting facts or repeating sensationalized tavern gossip. No Babylonian sources confirm his account. The thousands of cuneiform tablets excavated from Babylon's ruins discuss temple administration, property disputes, wedding contracts, and business deals. Yet they're curiously silent about this supposedly universal custom. Either Herodotus misunderstood a ritual he glimpsed, or the Babylonians didn't write about it because it was too sacred, too shameful, or too ordinary to document. You decide to look closer at what definitely did happen inside Ishtar's walls. The temple employed dozens of women in various religious roles. The Nuditu, who lived in cloistered quarters and never married, the Enter high priestesses who perform the most important rites, and the Harimtu, whose role remains frustratingly unclear in the historical record. That last word, Harimtu, gets translated as temple prostitute by some scholars and independent woman by others. the debate isn't just academic, it shapes how we understand an entire ancient profession. What's certain is that Ishtar herself embodied sexual power. Her myths describe her seducing gods and men alike, using her beauty and desire as tools of divine will. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, she propositions the hero king himself, promising him riches and power if he becomes her lover. When he refuses, listing all the previous lovers she destroyed, she flies into a rage and nearly destroys the world. To worship Ishtar was to acknowledge that sexuality wasn't shameful but sacred, a force as powerful as war or kingship. The priestesses who served her then weren't simply acting out base desires. They were embodying theological truths about fertility, creation, and the goddess's nature. You watch a ritual procession where priestesses dance through the streets wearing very little, their movements mimicking the sacred marriage between goddess and god that ensures the year's crops will grow. To Babylonian eyes, this isn't scandalous. It's necessary magic, the human enactment of cosmic forces. But magic and manipulation can wear the same robes. You discover records of a high priest named Nabu-Nadin-Shumi who controlled access to Ishtar's most prestigious rituals. Women who wanted to become unto priestesses, a position of enormous social prestige, had to pass through his approval process. And his criteria weren't just spiritual qualifications. Families whispered that he demanded private consultations with candidates, that his selection process involved tests no goddess would actually require. When a nobleman's daughter killed herself rather than complete his requirements, her father took the accusation to the king's court. The scandal that followed reveals something fascinating. Even in ancient Babylon, there were limits to what religious authority could excuse. Nabu-Nadin-Shumi was stripped of his position, though notably he wasn't executed or even exiled. The temple hierarchy treated the incident as an excess of zeal rather than abuse of power. They reassigned him to administrative duties where he'd have no contact with young initiates. The system protected itself while appearing to deliver justice, a pattern you'll see repeated across centuries and continents. Here's a quirky detail that survived in the historical record. Ishtar's temple kept detailed inventories of the sacred garments used in rituals, including items described as 7 veils of lapis lazuli and gold thread. These weren't ordinary clothes, they cost more than a working family earned in a year. Yet somehow, garments kept disappearing from the temple stores, showing up months later in the private homes of priests' wives and daughters. The temple accountants would note these discrepancies in their tablets with resigned phrases like, diverted for sacred purposes unknown, and redistributed by divine guidance, which were probably ancient Babylonian for, we know they're stealing but we can't prove it. The sexual aspects of Ishtar worship also created economic opportunities that had nothing to do with the sacred. Independent businesswomen operated establishments near the temple that deliberately blurred the line between religious ritual and commercial transaction. A man could tell his wife he was making an offering to the goddess while actually visiting what was functionally a brothel with religious aesthetics. The temple authorities knew this happened. They collected taxes on these establishments, but saw no reason to interfere. After all, the more people associated Ishtar with physical pleasure, the more popular her cult became, and the more donations flowed into temple coffers. You find yourself wondering what the priestesses themselves thought. Did the woman performing the sacred marriage ritual feel honored to embody the goddess? Or did she dissociate during the ceremony, thinking about dinner or tomorrow's laundry? Did the young Naditu, who took lifelong vows of celibacy, do so from genuine calling, or because her family couldn't afford a dowry and the temple was her only option for respectable survival. Ancient sources rarely give you their voices, just administrative records, myths told from the god's perspective, and foreign observers' judgments. One text does survive that might offer a glimpse. A poem copied by scribes for generations describes an Entu priestess speaking directly to Ishtar. "I have worn your crown of lapis. I have danced your sacred dance. I have opened myself as the gates of morning open to light. But at night, goddess, when the temple is silent, I wonder who I am beneath the rituals." Mand. Scholars debate whether this is genuine spiritual autobiography or literary fiction, but either way, it suggests that even true believers sometimes question the gap between the sacred ideal and the lived reality. As you prepare to leave Babylon, walking back through the Ishtar Gate as evening approaches, you glance back at the temple complex. Smoke rises from offering altars. Priests count the day's donations. Somewhere in those inner chambers, rituals you'll never fully understand are beginning. The building holds genuine faith and cynical exploitation in the same space, and after 4,000 years, you still can't fully untangle which is which. The Greeks who visited here brought home stories of sexual excess, but they missed the more subtle scandal: how religious institutions could take humanity's deepest longings, for meaning, for connection with the divine, for purpose, and sometimes, just sometimes, twist them into mechanisms of control and profit. You notice one final detail before the gate disappears behind you: a clay tablet wedged into a crevice, probably dropped by a scribe decades ago. You can't read cuneiform, but later scholars will translate it as a receipt. Received from the hand of Shala, daughter of Shamash, 3 silver shekels for the sacred rite of the goddess, witnessed by Belnasir, temple overseer. Just a transaction, recorded like buying barley. Was Shala a devout priestess performing holy work? A desperate woman with no other means of survival? A temple employee doing her assigned job? The tablet doesn't say, and perhaps that's the most unsettling part. How easily the sacred and the exploitative could become indistinguishable, reduced to a handful of silver and a scribe's notation in the books. The Babylonian model of temple economics would influence religious institutions for centuries to come. The idea that divine space could generate earthly wealth, that priests could broker transactions between human and holy. Other cultures would adapt the model, some maintaining the sexual elements, others finding different ways to monetize access to the gods. But Babylon wrote the original playbook, and the Ishtar Gate stands as its monument, beautiful and morally ambiguous, just like the institution it welcomed worshippers into. You're sailing up the Nile now around 1250 BCE, during the reign of Rameses II. The river's green banks contrast sharply with the desert beyond, and every few miles you pass another temple, massive stone structures that dwarf the mud brick homes clustered around them. Egypt's temples are the wealthiest institutions in the known world, controlling nearly 1/3 of all cultivated land and employing hundreds of thousands of workers. The priests who run these operations are among history's first organized clergy, and with that organization comes opportunities for corruption on a scale that would make Mesopotamian temple administrators jealous. You disembark at Karnak, where the temple of Amun-Ra sprawls across 250 acres. Walking through the hyper-style hall feels like entering a forest of stone. 134 columns rise around you, each one thick enough that 6 people linking arms couldn't encircle it. Somewhere in this vast complex, the High Priest of Amun commands resources that rival the Pharaoh's own treasury. And unlike the Pharaoh, who at least theoretically answers to Maat, the goddess of truth and justice, the High Priest answers primarily to himself. The position of high priest isn't spiritually appointed. You watch as the current high priest's son, barely 20 years old, undergoes the ritual that will transfer power to him. He hasn't demonstrated particular piety or wisdom. He simply happened to be born to the right father. Egyptian priestly positions have become hereditary offices, passed down through families like any other property. The young man taking office today will control vast estates, command armies of temple workers, and interpret the will of the gods for millions of people, all because of an accident of birth. Here's where the real scandal begins. Temple priests are supposed to maintain Egypt's grain reserves, a kind of ancient social safety net for years when the Nile flood fails and famine threatens. You examine the temple granaries, massive mud brick structures that should be overflowing after several good harvest years. But they're only half full. Where did the grain go? A scribe shows you the ledgers, though he nervously glances over his shoulder as he does. The records show grain being redistributed to sacred purposes and offered to the gods in amounts pleasing to their majesty. But these vague entries mask something more concrete. Priests have been selling temple grain on the private market during shortage years, when prices skyrocket. They buy low from the farmers who owe temple taxes, store it in the sacred granaries where it's supposedly untouchable, then sell high when desperation drives prices up. The profits go into private estates that priests establish far from temple oversight. One priest named Ranifer became so wealthy from these schemes that he built himself a tomb that archaeologists will one day mistake for a minor pharaoh's resting place. The paintings inside show him feasting while servants fan him with ostrich feathers, hunting exotic animals in lush gardens, and being attended by dozens of household staff. Nothing in these images suggests religious service or spiritual devotion, just ostentatious wealth. Yet Ranifer held one of the most sacred positions in Egyptian religion. He was the Sem priest who performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, the ritual that supposedly allowed deceased pharaohs to breathe, eat, and speak in the afterlife. Historians still argue whether Egyptian priests genuinely believed in the magic they performed, or cynically used religious ritual to maintain social control. The truth probably varied by individual. But what's certain is that belief and exploitation weren't mutually exclusive. You could sincerely think you were serving Mahat while also skimming temple funds, because you'd convinced yourself that priests deserved wealth as reward for their sacred service. The system of temple landholding created particularly cruel opportunities for abuse. Farmers who worked temple lands were technically free, not slaves, but their freedom was theoretical. They owed the temple a percentage of their harvest, usually around 50%. In bad years, when the Nile didn't flood properly and crops failed, farmers still owed that percentage. They'd fall into debt, and the debt was inherited by their children. Entire families became permanently bound to temple lands, effectively enslaved by religious obligations their great-grandparents had incurred. You meet a farmer named Kemoset, who grows barley on Amun's land. His grandfather borrowed grain from the temple 40 years ago during a famine. With interest, which temples charged despite preaching about charity, that original debt has multiplied 15-fold. Kemoset will never pay it off. Neither will his son. The priests know this, but they keep the family working because bound labourers are more reliable than free ones. When Kemoset asks if the gods truly demand such harsh terms, the priest tells him that questioning temple policy is questioning the gods themselves. It's a neat trick. Wrap economic exploitation in theological certainty, and resistance becomes heresy. Here's something darkly amusing. Egyptian priests were obsessed with ritual purity to an almost comical degree. They bathed in cold water multiple times daily, shaved their entire bodies every 3 days, wore only linen, never wool or leather inside sacred spaces, and abstained from certain foods. A priest who accidentally ate fish or touched a pig had to undergo elaborate purification ceremonies, yet these same men, so concerned with external cleanliness, saw nothing impure about embezzling funds meant to feed widows and orphans. One papyrus records a priest who delayed a funeral for 3 days because the family's offering included a wooden coffin that had, horror of horrors, been painted with a pigment containing fish oil. The priest demanded a replacement coffin before he'd perform the rites, never mind that the family had already spent everything they had on funeral preparations. The sale of priestly offices represents another scandal that grew worse over centuries. By the time you reach Egypt's late period, around 700 BCE, wealthy families are openly purchasing priesthoods for their sons the way other cultures might buy military commissions. The going rate for a mid-level position at a decent temple runs about 50 deben of silver, roughly what a skilled craftsman earns in 5 years. For that price, your son gets a title, an income, and social prestige. Whether he knows any theology, can read hieroglyphics, or believes in the gods is entirely beside the point. You discover records of one particularly brazen case where a merchant named Pediamenopet bought not just one priesthood, but an entire progression of them for his utterly unqualified nephew. The young man moved from wab priest, lowest rank, to God's father, quite high rank, in just 8 years, despite never learning to perform a single ritual correctly. Other priests whispered that he once burned the wrong incense during a ceremony and fell asleep during a vigil. But his uncle's money kept him climbing the temple hierarchy until a rival family finally exposed the scheme to royal authorities. The punishment reveals how these systems protected themselves. The nephew was removed from his position, yes, but he kept all the wealth he'd accumulated during his tenure. The merchant uncle paid a fine equal to about half what he'd originally spent buying the offices, essentially a bad investment rather than a crime. And the other priests who'd facilitated the fraud faced no consequences at all. The message was clear. The system could tolerate individual scandals as long as exposing them didn't threaten the larger structure of temple power and wealth. Sexual misconduct among Egyptian priests seems less common in the historical record than in Mesopotamia, possibly because Egyptian temples didn't incorporate fertility rituals involving priestesses. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. You find occasional hints. A complaint lodged against a priest who bothered young female musicians training for temple service, a passing reference to a high priest censured for keeping a concubine in temple quarters, a mysterious phrase about improper midnight rituals that later scribes deliberately defaced. The god Amun himself gets implicated in one of ancient Egypt's strangest political scandals. Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh despite being female, claimed that Amun had visited her mother in divine form and fathered her, making Hatshepsut the god's literal daughter and thus unquestionably legitimate. The priests of Amun confirmed this miraculous parentage through oracles and prophecies, but historians still argue whether Hatshepsut genuinely believed the story, whether the priests invented it to support an unprecedented female ruler they favoured, or whether it was a cynical deal. Hatshepsut got religious legitimacy, while Amun's temple received massive donations and building projects. Sometimes political convenience and sincere belief create partnerships where distinguishing between them becomes impossible. As evening falls over Karnak, you watch the daily ritual of closing the temple. Priests carry the god statue back into the innermost shrine, seal the doors, and light incense that drifts up toward the painted stars on the ceiling. To the crowds gathered outside, it's a moment of genuine awe. The gods are being put to rest. The cosmic order is being maintained. But you've seen the ledgers, met the farmers in perpetual debt, watched the entitled sons of wealthy families stumble through rituals they barely understand. The incense smells the same whether the priests are sincere or corrupt, and the crowds can't tell the difference. Perhaps that's the most enduring scandal, not any single act of misconduct, but the way religious systems could appear magnificent and holy on the outside while containing such human rot within. You're in southern India now, around 900 CE, though the practice you're investigating stretches back centuries earlier and will persist for 1,000 years more. The temple before you rises in tiers of intricately carved stone, every surface covered with images of gods, demons, animals, and humans in every conceivable pose. This is a temple dedicated to Shiva, and among the worshippers streaming through its gates are young girls, some barely 7 or 8 years old, who are about to be married to the god himself. The Devadasi system begins with what sounds like an honour. A family dedicates their daughter to temple service, and she becomes a servant of God, a woman who will never marry a mortal man because she's already the bride of the deity. In theory, this makes her auspicious, blessed, immune to the misfortune of widowhood that makes other women outcasts. She'll learn classical dance and music, arts that preserve ancient traditions. She'll participate in temple rituals, her very presence believed to bring divine favour. Some Devadasis become celebrated artists, their performances attended by royalty and remembered in poetry. But you're about to discover how quickly divine service can become earthly exploitation. You watch a dedication ceremony where a girl named Kamala, perhaps 9 years old, is draped in silk and flowers. Priests chant Sanskrit verses she doesn't understand while tying a sacred thread around her wrist, the tali that marks her as married to Lord Shiva. Her parents weep, though you can't tell if it's from religious devotion or because they know what they've really just done. In a society where daughters require expensive dowries and marriage arrangements that can bankrupt families, dedicating a girl to the temple solves an economic problem while appearing spiritually virtuous. It's a solution wrapped in a rationalization disguised as a blessing. Kamala will live in the temple complex, learning to dance the Bharatanatyam that tells stories of gods and heroes through precise hand gestures and footwork. Her teachers are older Devadasis, and some of them genuinely love the art they're passing down. In their movements, you see centuries of tradition, the same choreography that entertained the Chola emperors, that was old when this temple was new. Under different circumstances, this could be purely beautiful. But here's where the system reveals its darker architecture. Devadasis don't just serve the god, they serve the temple, and the temple serves the community's wealthy patrons. By the time Kamala reaches puberty, she'll be expected to perform another kind of service entirely. The same men who donated gold to gild the temple's gopuram, who sponsored festivals and commissioned sculptures, expect access to the Devadasis as part of their patronage privileges. The euphemism used is that these girls entertain important visitors, but you know what that really means. The theological justification goes like this. A Devadasi, married to a god, cannot be defiled by any human contact. Her divine marriage makes her permanently auspicious regardless of what happens to her body. Therefore, sexual relations with her aren't sinful. They're participatory worship, a way for devotees to connect with the divine through her blessed form. It's a perfect rationalization, the kind of theological gymnastics that lets everyone involved pretend exploitation is actually sacred. Historians still argue whether the earliest Devadasis actually engaged in these practices, or whether the system degraded over time, but by the medieval period, the pattern is unmistakable in the records. You discover that temples effectively operated hierarchies of Devadasis, the most talented dancers, the most beautiful, the most musically gifted. These became Raja Devadasis, royal servants who performed at courts and commanded respect and decent treatment. But below them were ranks of lesser-known girls who never developed notable artistic skills, who never caught a powerful patron's sustained interest, who became the temple's invisible workers. These girls cleaned, cooked, and yes, served male patrons in ways that had nothing to do with dance or devotion. One Portuguese traveller visiting India in the 1500s writes, with barely concealed disgust about watching a temple festival where Devadasis danced, describing them as temple prostitutes maintained by the Brahmins for their own pleasures and to entertain pilgrims of wealth. His account is biased. European Christians had their own reasons to paint Hindu practices as degenerate, but indigenous sources hint at similar realities. A Tamil poem from the 1300s describes a Devadasi's lament. I dance for the god at dawn, for the king at noon, for the merchant at night. My feet are blessed, but my body is tired. Which of these dances is truly for the divine? The economic structure underlying the system reveals itself in temple account books. Wealthy patrons would make donations specifically designated for the maintenance of Devadasis, and these funds were substantial, sometimes equaling what temples spent on all other operations combined. Follow that money, and you realize the Devadasi system had become a revenue stream too valuable to abandon. Temples in cities like Thanjavur and Madurai supported hundreds of Devadasis, meaning hundreds of families had transferred their daughters into this institution, and thousands of male patrons were paying for access that they convinced themselves was pious. Here's a quirky detail that survived in the records. Devadasis developed their own secret language, a coded vocabulary they used to communicate with each other about which patrons were dangerous, which priests were kind, which situations to avoid. Words that sounded like comments about music or dance actually warned newcomers about men who hurt the girls they entertained. This linguistic resistance was one of the few ways they could protect each other within a system designed to make them powerless. Not every Devadasi was miserable, which makes the whole system more morally complicated. You meet Mudupalani, a Devadasi who lived in the 1700s and became a celebrated poet. Her erotic poetry scandalized British colonizers, but revealed a woman who clearly enjoyed her literacy, her artistic freedom, and her ability to choose lovers rather than submit to an arranged marriage. I write what I please, she declared in one poem. I sleep with whom I please. What husband allows his wife such freedom? For her, the Devadasi system offered opportunities unavailable to respectable married women trapped in patriarchal households. But Mudupalani's experience was exceptional, the outcome for talented women with powerful protectors. For every celebrated Devadasi remembered in poetry, dozens suffered in obscurity. Temple records occasionally note a Devadasi's death from disease, violence, or childbirth complications, entries so brief they're easy to miss. Departed this life, one Devadasi, name of Lakshmi, in service 7 years. No family claimed her body, no one commissioned a memorial, and the temple filled her position within a month. The system also created generations of children born to Devadasis, technically illegitimate by conventional standards, but raised within temple communities. Sons of Devadasis often became temple musicians or priests. Daughters frequently became the next generation of Devadasis, inheriting their mother's dedication to the god along with all that entailed. You realize you're watching the creation of a hereditary caste of temple servants, people who couldn't leave even if they wanted to because they literally had nowhere else to go. Reformers began criticizing the system as early as the 1700s, but meaningful opposition didn't gather force until the British colonial period. Ironically, it took foreign Christian moralists, who had their own massive problems with sexual abuse by clergy, to finally push for legal abolition of the Devadasi system. The Bombay Devadasi Protection Act of 1934 banned the dedication of girls to temples, though enforcement was spotty, and the practice continued illegally in rural areas for decades more. Modern Bharatanatyam dancers face a complicated legacy. The dance form they practice, now celebrated as high art, taught in schools worldwide, performed on international stages, emerged directly from the Devadasi tradition. Should they acknowledge that history or distance themselves from it? Can you separate the beauty of the art from the exploitation of the artists? Historians still argue these questions, and dancers themselves hold diverse opinions about how to honour their art's origins while condemning the system that preserved it. As you leave the temple, you see a small museum dedicated to Devadasi culture, full of antique ankle bells, faded photographs, and sanitized descriptions of sacred dance traditions. A tour guide tells visitors about the respected temple dancers of ancient India, her language carefully scrubbed of anything uncomfortable. You notice that the young Western tourists nod appreciatively, snapping photos of the elegant costumes on display, entirely unaware of the complexity buried beneath the official narrative. Outside, an elderly woman sits in the shade selling flower garlands to worshippers. She's too old to be dancing anymore, and the deep lines in her face tell stories she'll never share with tourists. When you accidentally catch her eye, she doesn't look away, and in that moment you wonder what she's seen in her decades around this temple, what memories she carries about the supposedly golden age of sacred dance. But she doesn't speak to strangers, and her stories will die with her, becoming one more invisible layer in the archaeological record of how humans use religion to justify whatever they want to do anyway. You're climbing the slopes of Mount Parnassus now, approaching Delphi around 400 BCE, where the most famous oracle in the ancient world sits perched on a mountainside. Pilgrims have travelled from across the Greek world, from Athens, Sparta, Syracuse, even distant colonies on the Black Sea, all seeking prophecies from the Pythia, the priestess who speaks for Apollo himself. Kings make decisions about war and peace based on what she says. Cities plan their futures around her cryptic pronouncements. And behind the scenes, the priests who manage this operation are playing games that would impress any modern political consultant. The oracle works like this, at least officially. A woman, always called the Pythia, enters the inner chamber of Apollo's temple, sits on a tripod over a chasm in the earth, and breathes vapours rising from below. These vapours send her into a trance, and in that altered state, Apollo speaks through her. Her words come out as wild utterances, incoherent syllables that the priest then interpret into coherent prophecies. Petitioners pay substantial fees for these consultations, making Delphi one of the wealthiest religious sites in Greece. But you're beginning to notice some suspicious patterns. First, the chasm. Modern geologists have surveyed Delphi extensively and found no geological fissure under the temple, no source for intoxicating vapours. Either the ancient chasm closed up sometime in the past 2,000 years, which is possible but convenient, or the vapours were always theatrical fiction. Second, the Pythia's incoherent utterances somehow become remarkably coherent once filtered through the priest's interpretations and those interpretations tend to align suspiciously well with what's politically expedient for Delphi's interests. Here's how the manipulation works in practice. You watch as an envoy from Athens arrives seeking guidance about whether to attack Persia. He's paid an enormous consultation fee, enough silver to fund a warship for a month. The priests accept the payment, then make him wait 3 days for his appointed time. During those 3 days, other priests are quietly interviewing his servants, befriending his travelling companions, asking seemingly casual questions about Athenian politics, military readiness, and what answer the envoy hopes to hear. On consultation day, the Pythia enters her chamber, sits on her tripod, and begins swaying and moaning. Through a doorway you glimpse her, but here's what's interesting. She's not actually inhaling any vapours. She's just performing a trance, a ritualised theatre that everyone accepts because questioning it would be sacrilege. After some minutes of this, she speaks a few ambiguous phrases. The priests usher her out and begin their interpretation. The prophecy they deliver is a masterpiece of strategic ambiguity. If you cross the river, a great empire will fall. Perfect! If Athens attacks and wins, the prophecy was correct. Persia's empire fell. If Athens attacks and loses, the prophecy was still correct. Athens' empire fell. The oracle cannot be wrong because the oracle never says anything specific enough to be verifiably false. This isn't divine wisdom, it's linguistic craftsmanship designed to maintain Delphi's reputation no matter what happens. Historians still argue whether the Pythia herself believed she was channeling Apollo or knew she was part of an elaborate fraud. Some scholars suggest she might have actually achieved trance states through self-hypnosis, rhythmic breathing, or possibly consuming laurel leaves that have mild psychoactive properties. But even if her experiences felt genuine to her, the priest's interpretation process left plenty of room for manipulation. You discover that the priests keep extensive records about their consultations, not for religious purposes, but for political intelligence. They track which city-states are feuding, which alliances are forming, which kings are dying without clear heirs. When someone comes seeking prophecy, the priests already know the context surrounding the question. They can craft responses that appear divinely prescient but actually reflect excellent information networks and political savvy. The system generates spectacular wealth. Walking through the sacred way that leads to Apollo's temple, you pass dozens of treasuries, small temple-like buildings where various Greek cities store their offerings to the oracle. There's the Athenian treasury, with its marble friezes, the Siphnian treasury decorated with gold, the Corinthian treasury, the Cyclonian treasury. Each one represents decades of accumulated donations, thank offerings for prophecies that supposedly came true. The priests of Apollo control access to all of it. Here's where the corruption gets specific. A priest named Cobon, who served as one of the interpreters around 350 BCE, got caught accepting bribes from Philip Ced of Macedon. Philip wanted a prophecy declaring him the legitimate leader of the Greek world, so he sent Cobon a truly impressive amount of gold. The next time the Macedonian envoy consulted the oracle, wouldn't you know it, the Pythia pronounced that Philip enjoyed Apollo's special favour. Other Greek cities were outraged, but what could they do? Accuse the god of lying? That's blasphemy. Attack Delphi? That's starting a war with every other Greek state that relies on the oracle. Cobon eventually faced punishment, but not because he took bribes. Everyone knew bribes were standard practice. He got in trouble because he took Philip's money without sharing it properly with his fellow priests. The scandal was about treasury procedure, not spiritual corruption. After some internal discipline that conveniently remained secret, Cobon was quietly transferred to a lesser position, and the whole affair was smoothed over. The system protected itself. The oracle's ambiguity created a kind of theological safety net. There's a famous story about King Croesus of Lydia, who tested various oracles by asking them what he was doing on a specific day at a specific time. Only Delphi got it right, declaring he was boiling a tortoise and lamb together in a bronze cauldron. Impressed, Croesus later asked whether he should attack Persia. The oracle responded, "If Croesus crosses the Halys River, a great empire will be destroyed." Croesus crossed, attacked, and lost everything. His kingdom destroyed. When he complained that the oracle had misled him, the priest replied that the prophecy had been accurate. A great empire was indeed destroyed. His own. "Should have been more specific in your question, King Croesus. This story gets retold as evidence of the oracle's cunning accuracy, but think about what it really reveals. If Croesus had won, the priests would have claimed credit for predicting his victory. Since he lost, they blamed his interpretation. It's a system that can never be wrong because it's designed to be unfalsifiable. Not all the priests were cynical manipulators. You meet one named Diogenes who seems genuinely conflicted about the operation. He believes Apollo really does communicate with humanity, that the divine exists and sometimes offers guidance. But he also knows the vapours are theatrical, knows his colleagues accept bribes, knows the prophecies are crafted as much by political calculation as divine inspiration. Can both be true? He asks you over wine one evening. Can the god work through human instruments, even when those instruments are flawed? It's actually a sophisticated theological question, the kind that religious traditions will wrestle with for millennia. The architectural design of the temple itself facilitates deception. The inner sanctum where the Pythia sits is separated from the petitioners by walls and curtains. Only the interpreting priests can see and hear her directly. This creates information control. The priests can claim she said anything, and no one can verify it. The acoustic properties of the chamber also do something clever. Sounds from the Pythia's chamber emerge distorted and echoey when they reach the outer areas, making her voice seem otherworldly and impossible to understand without priestly translation. Here's a quirky detail. The priest employed a junior staffer whose entire job was to create atmospheric sounds during consultations. He'd hide behind a curtain with various instruments, drums, bells, a wind whistle, and add mysterious noises at dramatically appropriate moments. One day this sound man got drunk and fell asleep during an important consultation, and the prophecy session happened in suspicious silence. The petitioner apparently commented on the unusual quiet, and the priest had to quickly improvise an explanation about Apollo being especially calm that day. The sound man was transferred to cleaning duties after that incident. The Romans, when they eventually conquered Greece, kept Delphi running because they understood its utility. A prophecy from Delphi could legitimize political decisions, shift public opinion, or provide cover for controversial policies. "The gods want this" is always easier than "I want this." Various Roman emperors consulted the oracle, and the priests adapted their political calculations to new masters. The prophecies started reflecting Roman interests rather than Greek ones, proving that the oracle's loyalty was always to its own survival and wealth. As you descend Mount Parnassus at sunset, you look back at the temple complex glowing in the last light. From this distance, it looks eternal and majestic, the kind of place where gods might actually speak. But you've seen behind the curtain now. You know about the hidden chambers, the stage performances, the careful interpretation system, the political intelligence networks. The oracle isn't a window to the divine. It's a sophisticated operation run by smart men who understood that controlling information and managing ambiguity could generate power and wealth for centuries. Do you remember the farmer in Egypt, trapped by debt he'd inherited? The temples might change their methods, but the pattern remains. Religious authority creates opportunities for those who know how to exploit it. You're standing in the Roman Forum now, around 114 BCE, and the entire city is holding its breath. 3 Vestal virgins, priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, have been accused of breaking their vows of chastity. If the accusations are true, the punishment is horrifying. They'll be buried alive in an underground chamber with a small amount of bread and water, then sealed in to die slowly in the darkness. Their alleged lovers will be beaten to death in the Forum. But if the accusations are false, innocent women will suffer one of Rome's cruelest executions, and the men bringing charges will have weaponized religion for political purposes. The Vestal virgins occupy a unique position in Roman society. Selected as children, usually between ages 6 and 10 from aristocratic families, they serve the goddess for 30 years. During that time, they must remain virgins, tend the sacred fire that must never go out, and perform rituals essential to Rome's safety. In exchange, they receive privileges no other Roman women possess. They can own property, write wills, testify in court, and walk through the city attended by lictors like magistrates. They're so sacred that if they accidentally encounter a condemned criminal being led to execution, the criminal receives an immediate pardon. But the flip side of their sacredness is terror. If a Vestal breaks her vow, the Romans believe catastrophe will strike the city, military defeat, plague, famine. The punishment isn't just about the individual woman's sin, it's about protecting Rome from divine wrath, and that belief creates a perfect opportunity for manipulation. You watch as the 3 accused Vestals, Aemilia, Licinia and Marcia, stand before the Pontifical College, the board of priests who will judge them. They're young women, barely into their 20s, and their faces show confusion more than guilt. The charges are vague. They've been seen in company with men. They've conducted themselves immodestly. They've brought disgrace to the sacred order. No one claims to have actually witnessed sexual acts, just proximity and rumour. The political context tells you what's really happening. Rome has suffered several military setbacks recently. Defeats in Gaul, setbacks in Spain. Politicians are looking for scapegoats, and the Vestals are convenient targets. If they can be shown to have broken their vows, then Rome's defeats make sense. The gods are angry because the sacred fire tenders were impure. It's theology being used to deflect from military and political incompetence. The trials reveal how little evidence is actually required when religious authority combines with public panic. One witness testifies that he saw Licinia laughing with a young man near the Temple of Vesta. Another claims Marcia once attended a dinner party where the conversation was inappropriately jovial. A third says Aemilia looked at a senator with soft eyes. This is it. This is the evidence that might get 3 women buried alive. No physical proof, no caught-in-the-act testimony, just impressions and interpretations filtered through the witness's own assumptions about how a Vestal should behave. Historians still argue whether any of these women actually had sexual relationships, or whether they were completely innocent victims of political theatre. The historical record is frustratingly unclear, written decades later by men with their own agendas. But what's certain is that the trial process itself was designed to produce convictions whenever politically necessary. Here's how the system was rigged. The Pontifical College voting on guilt included many of the same politicians who benefited from having a religious explanation for Rome's military problems. Voting against conviction meant implicitly taking blame for the defeats. Maybe the generals were incompetent rather than the Vestals impure. Much easier to vote for conviction and let the gods take the blame. Additionally, the chief Vestal, the senior priestess who might have defended her sisters, had recently died, leaving the younger women vulnerable without an experienced advocate. The first vote acquits all three women, surprisingly. But then something extraordinary happens. A tribune named Sextus Peducaeus stands up and declares the verdict invalid because the judges showed insufficient severity in protecting Rome's sacred honour. He demands a new trial before a different panel, one with judges he personally selects. This should be impossible. Double jeopardy protections exist even in ancient Rome. But religious crimes operate under different rules, and Peducaeus has enough political support to force the retrial. The second trial, held weeks later with hand-picked judges, convicts Aemilia and Licinia. Marcia receives another acquittal, though no one can quite explain why she's innocent, while her co-accused are guilty based on essentially identical evidence. Political calculus rather than actual guilt determined the outcome. 2 convictions were enough to satisfy public demand for a divine explanation, while one acquittal let the system pretend it had been fair and careful. You follow the convicted women as they're led to the Campus Celeratus, the evil field, a small plot of land near the Colline Gate reserved for this specific horror. Underground chambers have already been prepared, rooms barely large enough to stand in, accessed by ladder. The executioners place a lamp, a loaf of bread, a jug of water, and a small amount of milk in each chamber. Then Aemilia and Licinia are forced down the ladders, and workers seal the chambers with earth and stones. The cruelty is the point. Rome doesn't simply execute Vestals who break their vows. It walls them up alive so that technically the state hasn't killed them. The women die of starvation or suffocation, and the blood guilt belongs to the gods rather than to Rome. It's a legal fiction that lets Romans feel morally clean while committing murder. Their alleged lovers, a man named Lucius Veturius for Aemilia and Manlius for Licinia, are beaten to death in the Forum the same day. Unlike the Vestals, they get straightforward execution, no theological complications. The crowd that gathers to watch is enormous, and you notice that the atmosphere feels like festival as much as punishment. Vendors sell food, people place bets on how many blows it will take. Children climb statues for better views. Horror has become entertainment because it's wrapped in religious righteousness. Not every accused Vestal faced conviction. You discover records of other trials where women were acquitted, sometimes because they had powerful family connections, sometimes because the political moment didn't require a scapegoat. A Vestal named Tuccia, accused around 230 BCE, supposedly proved her innocence through a miracle. She carried water from the Tiber in a sieve without spilling a drop, demonstrating divine favour. The cynical reading is that someone with engineering knowledge rigged a trick sieve to help her. The faithful reading is that Vesta herself intervened. Either way, Tuccia walked free while women with less impressive defences or weaker family backing didn't. Here's a quirky detail that reveals how the system really worked. The Vestal's residence, the Atrium Vestae, had a back garden with a private exit that led to a network of wealthy homes. Married Roman women were severely restricted in their movements, but Vestals could come and go freely, dine at aristocratic houses, attend theatre performances. This freedom meant they mixed constantly with Rome's elite men, creating countless opportunities for the rumours and improper proximity that could later become accusations. The system set them up to fail while simultaneously punishing them for failing. The political usefulness of Vestal trials meant they occurred with suspicious frequency during times of crisis. Military disaster, time to investigate the Vestals. Political upheaval, better check if the sacred fire tenders are pure. Economic collapse, those Vestals are looking pretty suspicious. It's the ancient equivalent of blaming economic problems on immigrants, or crime waves on moral decay. Find a vulnerable group, claim they're causing the real problems, and distract from actual systemic failures. Some of the accusations were probably true. 30 years is a long time to maintain celibacy, especially when you're surrounded by Rome's most powerful and charismatic men, attending parties, engaging in sophisticated conversation, living a life far more interesting than most Roman women experienced. Some Vestals probably did have affairs, took lovers, maintained secret relationships. But the system that punished them was never really about sexual purity. It was about control, about having a release valve for public anger, about maintaining the fiction that Rome's problems were spiritual rather than political. As you leave the Campus Sceleratus, you look back at the freshly sealed earth that now serves as two women's tombs. In the underground darkness, Emilia and Licinia are dying slowly, probably already unconscious from lack of oxygen. Were they guilty? Innocent? Does it even matter when the trial was rigged from the start? The lamp will burn out in a few hours, and then there will be only darkness and then nothing at all. Their families won't be able to mourn them publicly. That would be admitting the shame. Their names will be struck from official records, their belongings burned, their existences erased as thoroughly as possible. The only reason history remembers them at all is because their trial happened to involve a political scandal, important enough that later historians recorded the details. How many other women suffered the same fate without even leaving names behind? You're standing atop the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan now, around 1487 CE, during the reign of Ahuitzotl, and the scene before you is almost impossible to process. The twin pyramids rise 15 stories high, dedicated to Huitzilopochtli, god of war and sun, and Tlaloc, god of rain. Between them runs a channel of blood. Not metaphorical blood, actual human blood flowing in rivers down the pyramid steps. The priests estimate they'll sacrifice 20,000 people over the next 4 days to celebrate the temple's rededication. Some modern scholars think that number is exaggerated Spanish propaganda. Others think it might be conservative. The Aztec priests who orchestrate these ceremonies aren't hidden figures working in secret chambers like their counterparts in other cultures. They're public performers, and human sacrifice is the centerpiece of Aztec religious and political life. But you're about to discover that what looks like pure religious devotion from the outside is actually tangled up with economics, politics, and social control in ways that make calling it simply religion or simply murder inadequate to capture the reality. The theological justification goes like this. The sun god Huitzilopochtli fights a daily battle against darkness. Without constant nourishment from human hearts and blood, he'll weaken and die, the sun will stop rising, and the universe will end. Therefore, human sacrifice isn't murder, it's cosmic maintenance. The most important work humans can perform, every heart cut from a living chest, every captive warrior sent to feed the gods, is an act of salvation that keeps reality itself functioning. But watch what actually happens, and you see layers of other purposes being served. The victims stretched across the sacrificial stone today aren't random. They're war captives from neighbouring peoples, specifically from cities that resist Aztec domination. Their public execution serves as spectacular propaganda. Resist us, and this is your fate. It's terrorism wrapped in theology, a demonstration of power that keeps subject peoples terrified and compliant. You notice the priests performing the sacrifices aren't just any priests. They're members of specific elite families who've controlled these positions for generations. To become a priest capable of performing the heart extraction ceremony requires years of training in specialized schools, the Kalmakak, that only aristocratic boys can attend. The priesthood is a hereditary caste as much as a spiritual calling, and the men wielding the obsidian knives are the same families who own vast estates, control trade networks, and advise the emperor. Here's where the economics get interesting. The Aztec Empire demands tribute from conquered cities: corn, cacao, precious stones, cloth, and humans. Those humans serve two purposes. They're sacrificed at major ceremonies, and the threat of being selected for sacrifice keeps conquered populations desperate to meet their other tribute obligations. Miss your corn quota, and maybe your daughter gets taken to Tenochtitlan for the next festival. It's a brutally effective compliance system. The bodies don't go to waste either. After priests cut out the hearts and raise them to the sun, after the blood flows down the temple steps in the prescribed manner, the bodies are returned to the captors who brought them. Historical accounts, both Aztec codices and Spanish chronicles, describe what happens next, though historians still argue about how commonly it occurred. The flesh is sometimes consumed in ritual meals, a practice the Aztecs called tlacatlacuali. Whether this was purely religious symbolism, nutritional supplementation during times of protein scarcity, or something more complex remains debated. One priest you observe seems particularly efficient at his work. His name is Tlacaelel, and he's not just a priest but the Cihuacoatl, essentially the prime minister of the Aztec Empire. He's the one who restructured Aztec religion to emphasize human sacrifice on an unprecedented scale. Before his reforms, the Aztecs practiced sacrifice like most Mesoamerican cultures, occasionally for major events. Tlacaelel systematized it, institutionalized it, turned it into the engine that drove imperial expansion. His logic was political genius masked as theology. By declaring that the sun required constant sacrifice, he created perpetual justification for the flower wars, staged battles with neighboring cities designed primarily to capture prisoners for sacrifice rather than conquer territory. These wars kept the Aztec military trained and active even during peacetime, terrified neighboring peoples, and provided the steady stream of victims that the sacrificial calendar demanded. And conveniently, the same priestly class that Tlacaelel belonged to controlled the entire operation, from organizing the wars to performing the sacrifices to distributing the victims' remains. You watch as a young priest in training makes his first kill. He's probably 15, from a noble family, and his hands shake as he raises the obsidian knife. The victim is a Tlaxcalan warrior, maybe 20 years old, who's been drugged with pulque so he won't struggle too much. 4 older priests hold the warrior down while the boy cuts. He hesitates, and a senior priest guides his hand, showing him the exact angle needed to penetrate between the ribs and reach the still-beating heart. The boy vomits afterward, but the senior priest congratulates him. He's passed an important threshold in his training. Here's something that reveals the human cost beyond the obvious victims. Priests who perform regular sacrifices develop psychological problems that Aztec society doesn't have language to describe. You meet an older priest who drinks pulque constantly to numb himself, who can't sleep without nightmares, whose hands never stop shaking. He's killed hundreds, maybe thousands of people over his decades of service. He believes absolutely in the theological necessity of his work. Without it, the sun would die. But belief doesn't protect him from trauma. The Aztec system has no concept of PTSD, no support for priests damaged by the violence they're required to commit, so they self-medicate and suffer silently. The scale of sacrifice creates practical problems too. 20,000 bodies over 4 days means the priests work in shifts, almost assembly line style, to keep the killing pace sustainable. The victims wait in holding pens, hearing the drums and screams from the pyramid top, knowing their turn approaches. Some historical accounts mention that certain victims had to be physically restrained because the drugs wore off before their turn came. Others describe victims who went willingly, even eagerly, because they'd been raised to believe that dying this way guaranteed paradise, a better afterlife than dying of disease or old age. Historians still argue whether the Aztecs genuinely believed their own theology or cynically used religion to justify empire building. The answer is probably both and rather than either or. The priests likely did believe the sun needed nourishment. They'd been taught this since childhood, had never encountered alternative cosmologies, and could point to the fact that the sun did indeed rise every morning as proof their sacrifices worked. But they also benefited enormously from the system in wealth, power, and social status. Sincere belief and self-interest aren't mutually exclusive. They can reinforce each other into an unshakable conviction that what serves you personally also serves the cosmic order. The Spanish, when they arrive in 1519, will be simultaneously horrified and hypocritical about Aztec practices. They'll describe the sacrifices with genuine revulsion, painting the Aztecs as demonic savages. But these same Spaniards burn heretics alive, torture conversion-resistant indigenous people, and commit their own massacres in the name of Christianity. The difference isn't that one culture is violent and the other isn't. It's that cultures sanction different types of violence for different theological reasons. One detail that rarely makes it into popular history: the Aztecs had dissenters, people who questioned the sacrificial system. A philosopher named Nezahualcoyotl, who ruled the city-state of Texcoco, wrote poetry suggesting that maybe the gods didn't actually require so much blood, that perhaps violence was a human invention attributed to divine will. His verses survived because he was powerful enough that priests couldn't simply silence him. But how many others questioned and disappeared, accused of heresy or cosmic treason? You'll never know, because only the victor's theology gets recorded. As the sun sets over Tenochtitlan, painting the blood-stained pyramids orange and red, you realize the killing will continue all night by torchlight. The drums never stop. The victims keep climbing, the priests keep cutting, and everyone involved, from the emperor to the lowest priest to the victims themselves, exists within a worldview where this horror makes perfect sense, even feels necessary and holy. That's perhaps the deepest scandal, not just that humans commit atrocities, but that we're capable of building entire civilizations around them, of raising children to believe that carving out hearts is sacred duty, of making murder so systematic and ritualized that it becomes mundane. The Mesopotamian priestess, the Egyptian grain embezzler, the Greek oracle manipulator, they all bent rules or exploited systems. The Aztec priests created a system where the exploitation was the point, where theology demanded violence on a scale that served empire building perfectly, and they probably went home at night believing they'd done holy work. You're standing in a medieval town square somewhere in Germany around 1517, though the practices you're investigating stretch back centuries before this moment, A Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel has set up shop beneath a colourful banner, and he's giving the sales pitch of his life. When a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs, he declares, his voice carrying across the crowd. He's selling indulgences, official documents from the church that reduce time in purgatory, and business is booming. An old woman approaches with her last few coins, terrified that her deceased husband is suffering in purgational flames. Tetzel takes her money, hands her a certificate decorated with papal seals, and assures her she's just purchased years off her husband's torment. This is corruption so blatant that it will eventually fracture Christianity itself, sparking the Protestant Reformation. But what you're witnessing isn't some rogue operation. It's official church policy, sanctioned by Pope Leo himself, part of a sophisticated fundraising scheme to build St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. The theology of purgatory, the doctrine of indulgences, the entire apparatus of medieval Catholic salvation, it's all been weaponized into a money-making machine that would make any modern megachurch televangelist jealous. The theological foundation starts reasonably enough. Medieval Catholics believed that sins require punishment, some temporal punishment even after the eternal punishment is forgiven through confession. Purgatory is where souls undergo this purification before entering heaven. The Church, as keeper of Christ's infinite merits, and the saints' surplus good works, can draw on this treasury of merit to reduce purgatory time. Originally, indulgences required genuine penance, prayer, fasting, pilgrimage. But over centuries the system evolved until monetary payments became acceptable substitutes for spiritual work. By the time you reach the early 1500s, the indulgence system has become completely financialized. Pope Leo X needs enormous funds to complete St. Peter's Basilica, so he issues a special Jubilee indulgence. He partners with the Archbishop of Mainz, who's deeply in debt to the Fugger banking family. The deal works like this. The Archbishop gets permission to sell indulgences in his territories, keeps half the proceeds to pay his debt, and sends half to Rome. The Fugger Bank actually stations representatives at sales sites to collect their share immediately. It's not religion anymore, it's investment banking with papal approval. Tetzel is the star salesman in this operation, and he's good at his job. You watch him work the crowd with techniques that combine psychological manipulation, theatrical flair, and genuine spiritual conviction. He describes purgatory's torments in vivid detail, the flames that burn without consuming, the centuries of suffering, the desperate cries of souls begging for relief. Then he offers the solution, holding up his certificates like tickets to freedom. Will you not spare a few coins to rescue your mother from the flames? Would Christ hesitate? Would Mary? The prices are scaled to income levels. A king pays the equivalent of several gold ducats. A merchant pays less. A poor farmer can buy an indulgence for a few pennies. It's progressive pricing designed to extract maximum revenue from every economic class. Tetzel even offers bulk discounts. Buy indulgences for multiple deceased relatives and save. Some historians found records of purchase agreements that read exactly like modern sales contracts, complete with payment plans for customers who can't afford the full price up front. Here's where it gets darker. Tetzel explicitly claims these indulgences work not just for the buyer, but for deceased relatives who never had a chance to purchase their own. Imagine being a medieval peasant, believing your mother is literally burning in purgatory, and this official church representative tells you that for the price of a week's wages, you can end her suffering. The emotional manipulation is staggering. The theological claim that you can purchase someone else's salvation with money would have horrified early Christians, but by 1517 it's standard operating procedure. The money flows upward through layers of corruption. Local priests who sell indulgences take a commission. Bishops who organize the sales take a larger cut. Archbishops who negotiate the papal authorization take even more. Banking families who finance the operation extract interest. And Rome gets the remainder to fund its architectural ambitions. St. Peter's Basilica, one of Christianity's most magnificent buildings, is literally built with money extracted from poor people's fears about their dead relatives' suffering. Not everyone accepts this quietly. Epps, a priest named Martin Luther, teaching theology at a university in Wittenberg, becomes increasingly troubled by what he's witnessing. His parishioners skip confession and genuine repentance because they've bought indulgences. Why bother with spiritual work when you can just buy forgiveness? Luther writes 95 theses, basically a list of debate points, questioning the theology and practice of indulgences. According to legend, he nails them to the church door on October 3rd, 1517. Whether he actually did this or simply sent them to his bishop is debated by historians, but the timing is significant. October 31st is All Saints' Eve, when indulgent sales traditionally peaked because people's thoughts turned to the dead. Luther's objections aren't initially about overthrowing the church. He's trying to reform a corrupt practice within the system. But his theses spread rapidly thanks to the printing press. That new technology that lets dangerous ideas reproduce faster than authorities can suppress them. Within weeks, copies are circulating throughout German-speaking lands. Within months, all of Europe is discussing whether the Pope can actually sell salvation. The Church's response reveals how deeply the corruption has penetrated. Instead of acknowledging the problem, Church authorities double down. Pope Leo X supposedly dismisses Luther as some drunken German who will change his mind when he sobers up. Dominican theologians defend the indulgent system vigorously, because Dominicans like Tetzel are running the sales operation. The Archbishop of Mainz wants Luther silenced because the controversy is hurting revenue. When theological argument and political pressure fail to quiet Luther, the Church declares him a heretic and threatens him with execution. But the scandal has exposed something that can't be rehidden: the gap between the Church's spiritual claims and its financial practices. You discover that similar scams are running throughout Christendom. In England, bishops sell ecclesiastical positions to the highest bidder, a practice called simony that's technically forbidden but widely practiced. In France, wealthy families purchase cardinalships for their teenage sons, who know nothing about theology but enjoy the income and prestige. In Italy, several popes have maintained mistresses and fathered children, living in luxury that would make ancient Roman emperors envious. Pope Alexander VI, who served from 1492 to 1503, represents the apex of papal corruption before Luther's time. A member of the notorious Borgia family, he bought his way to the papacy through bribery, maintained multiple mistresses openly, used church funds to finance wars benefiting his illegitimate children, and allegedly poisoned cardinals whose wealth he wanted to confiscate. When he died, possibly poisoned himself in a plot gone wrong, Roman citizens celebrated in the streets. Yet during his entire corrupt reign, no significant reform movement emerged within the Church itself. The system was too profitable for too many people. Here's a quirky detail. Some medieval bishops employed professional pardoners who travelled from town to town selling indulgences, relics, and other spiritual goods. Chaucer satirised one in the Canterbury Tales, describing a pardoner who carried fake relics. A pillowcase he claimed was Mary's veil. Pig bones, he said, belonged to saints. and made more money than the local priest. Chaucer was writing fiction, but he based it on reality so recognisable that his audience immediately understood the reference. The indulgent scandal represents something larger than simple fraud. It reveals what happens when a religious institution becomes inseparable from political and economic power, when theology serves fundraising more than truth, when the same organisation that claims to speak for God is also running what's essentially a protection racket. Pay us money, or your loved ones suffer. The medieval church had built a system where fear of the afterlife generated revenue in this life, where divine judgment could be negotiated with sufficient cash, where salvation itself became a commodity to be bought and sold like grain or cloth. As evening falls and Tetzel packs up his certificates and coin boxes, you watch the people who bought indulgences walking away. Some look relieved, genuinely believing they've helped their deceased relatives. Others look troubled, starting to wonder whether God's grace can really be purchased from a travelling salesman. A young monk in the crowd, you don't know his name, but maybe it's someone who'll later join the Reformation, watches with visible disgust. The coins in Tetzel's strongbox will travel to Rome, helping pay for basilica construction, while the people who donated them eat thinner meals tomorrow. Do you remember the Babylonian priests who kept multiple account books to hide their wealth? The medieval church has perfected the practice, wrapping financial exploitation in theological language so sophisticated that it took centuries before enough people questioned whether God actually endorsed the system claiming to represent his will. You're in St. Petersburg, Russia, in 1908, and the most dangerous man in the empire has just walked into the palace. He's not a revolutionary, not an assassin, not a foreign spy. He's a Siberian peasant with wild hair, a tangled beard, and eyes that people say can see into your soul. His name is Grigory Rasputin, and within a few years his influence over Russia's royal family will help destabilize an empire and contribute to one of history's bloodiest revolutions. But tonight, he's just a holy man who's been summoned to the palace because the Tsarevich, the heir to the Russian throne, is bleeding to death from haemophilia, and no doctor can help him. You watch as Rasputin enters the child's bedroom. The boy, Alexei, is 9 years old and screaming in agony. His blood won't clot, and every movement brings fresh internal bleeding. His mother, Tsarina Alexandra, is frantic. She's already lost one child and can't bear losing another. The doctors stand helplessly by. Rasputin approaches the bed, stares at the child with those unsettling eyes, and begins to pray. He speaks in a low, rhythmic voice, almost hypnotic. Within an hour, the boy's pain subsides. The bleeding stops. By morning, Alexei is sleeping peacefully. Was it divine intervention? Medical historians suggest Rasputin might have simply calmed the boy, reducing his blood pressure and stress levels, which helped the bleeding stop naturally. Others propose that Rasputin's advice to stop giving Alexei aspirin, which doctors had been prescribing and which thins the blood, accidentally provided the correct treatment. Or maybe the bleeding would have stopped anyway, and Rasputin's timing was fortunate. But to Alexandra, desperate and devout, this is clearly a miracle. From this moment forward, Rasputin owns her absolute trust. That trust is what Rasputin exploits over the next decade, building influence that reaches from the palace bedchamber to the highest levels of government. He's not technically a priest. He's a stranic, a wandering holy man, part of a Russian Orthodox tradition of spiritual seekers who reject conventional clergy in favour of direct mystical experience. But in practice, he functions as the royal family's private religious authority, their confessor, their spiritual guide. and he abuses that position in ways that scandalize even Russia's notoriously corrupt aristocracy. The sexual component of Rasputin's scandal dominates both contemporary gossip and historical accounts. According to numerous reports, from police surveillance files, aristocratic memoirs, and newspaper exposés, Rasputin teaches a particularly convenient theology. He preaches that sin is necessary for redemption, that you must fall deeply into sin before you can truly repent and receive grace. The more you sin, the more glorious your eventual salvation. It's a theological framework that justifies, even mandates, sexual indulgence, and Rasputin offers himself as the instrument through which aristocratic women can achieve this salvific sinning. You discover police reports documenting Rasputin's activities. His apartment becomes notorious for gatherings where religious ecstasy and sexual activity blend indistinguishably. Women from St. Petersburg's higher social circles visit him, ostensibly for spiritual counsel. What happens behind closed doors becomes the subject of intense speculation and, apparently, surveillance. One police report describes him entertaining multiple women simultaneously, calling it prayer and communing with the divine. Another records a conversation where Rasputin told a woman that sleeping with him would purify her soul because his body had been blessed by God. Historians still argue about how much of this is true versus malicious propaganda from Rasputin's enemies. He had many enemies: aristocrats who resented his influence, clergy who saw him as a heretical fraud, politicians who blamed him for the government's dysfunction. They had motives to exaggerate or fabricate scandal, but the sheer volume of reports from independent sources, including police surveillance conducted before his enemies launched their propaganda campaign, suggests that at least some of it is accurate. What's certain is that Rasputin uses his spiritual authority to gain access to women who would normally be unreachable to a peasant. One account describes him visiting a young noblewoman and declaring that God had revealed she needed to be cleansed of pride through humiliation. The cleansing involved her undressing while he remained clothed, supposedly to test her obedience to divine will. Another woman reported that Rasputin told her husband, an army officer, that true faith required him to share his wife with God's chosen vessel, meaning Rasputin himself. When the officer objected, Rasputin suggested he lacked sufficient spirituality. The most disturbing aspect is how Rasputin's position near the throne protects him from consequences. Women who complain find their accusations dismissed by authorities who don't want to antagonize the Tsarina. When Bishop Hermogen confronts Rasputin about the sexual rumors and physically attacks him, demanding he leave St. Petersburg, it's the bishop who gets punished, exiled to a remote monastery. Rasputin's connection to Alexandra makes him effectively untouchable. He's discovered something that religious predators throughout history have learned. If you can position yourself as spiritually essential to someone powerful, you can get away with almost anything. His influence extends beyond sexual exploitation into political corruption. Rasputin begins selling his access to the royal family. Businessmen pay him to mention their proposals to the Tsar. Noblemen seeking government positions offer him bribes to recommend them. During World War I, when the Tsar is away commanding the army and Alexandra is effectively running the government, Rasputin's influence reaches its peak. He recommends ministers based not on competence, but on who's paid him or shown him loyalty. Russia's government becomes a revolving door of incompetent appointees whose primary qualification is having pleased the holy man. Here's a quirky detail that reveals both Rasputin's cunning and his genuine charisma. He deliberately cultivates his appearance as a wild, unwashed peasant, despite having enough money to dress like an aristocrat. He understands that his power comes from appearing to be an authentic voice from the Russian soil, uncorrupted by urban sophistication. When he does occasionally dress in fine clothes, people comment that he loses some of his mystical aura. The dirt and smell are part of his brand, proof of his holy indifference to worldly vanity. The aristocracy becomes increasingly alarmed as Rasputin's influence grows and Russia's war effort deteriorates. They see a direct connection. This charlatan holy man is controlling the government through the Tsarina's superstition, and Russia is losing the war as a result. Whether Rasputin actually caused Russia's military problems is debatable, but he becomes a convenient symbol of everything wrong with the autocratic system. A group of aristocrats led by Prince Felix Yusupov decides to assassinate him. The plot they execute in December 1916 becomes legendary for how difficult Rasputin proves to kill. Yusupov invites him to his palace, serves him cakes and wine laced with massive amounts of cyanide. Rasputin eats and drinks, and nothing happens. Growing desperate, Yusupov shoots him in the chest. Rasputin falls, apparently dead. But when Yusupov checks the body, Rasputin's eyes open, and he attacks his assassin, chasing him into the courtyard. The other conspirators shoot him several more times. They beat him with clubs. Finally, they wrap his body in a carpet and throw it into the frozen Neva River. When the body is recovered days later, the autopsy reveals that Rasputin was still alive when he entered the water. He died of drowning, not gunshot wounds or poisoning. Some historians question these details as exaggerated legend, but the basic facts are confirmed. Killing Rasputin required multiple attempts and multiple methods. The difficulty of murdering him only enhances his mystique, suggesting he possessed some supernatural resilience. But Rasputin's death doesn't save Russia. Within 3 months, revolution sweeps the country. The Tsar abdicates. Within 18 months, the entire royal family is executed in a basement in Yekaterinburg, including young Alexei, the haemophiliac boy whose illness gave Rasputin his initial access to power. Historians still argue about Rasputin's role in the revolution. Was he a symptom of the system's decay or a cause of its collapse? Probably some of both. But what's clear is that a religious charlatan with legitimate charisma and healing abilities, however they worked, exploited a desperate family's faith to gain power he never should have possessed, and used it for personal gratification and profit. As you leave the palace one final time, you think about the pattern you keep seeing. The Mesopotamian priests, the Egyptian grain embezzlers, the divinity exploitation, the Delphic manipulators, the Vestal trials, the Aztec sacrifices, the indulgence sellers, and now Rasputin. Different cultures, different theologies, different methods, but the same core dynamic. Religious authority creates power asymmetries that some people will inevitably exploit. Rasputin didn't invent sexual predation by spiritual leaders. He just did it at the highest level of society with consequences that helped topple an empire. The woman who came to him for spiritual counsel, the aristocrat who paid him for political access, the Tsarina who trusted him to heal her son, they were all seeking something genuine, something sacred. What they got instead was a man who understood that humans will forgive almost anything from someone they believe has access to the divine. You're in Nauvoo, Illinois in 1843, and the religious community around you is built on a foundation of secrets. The Mormons, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, have fled persecution in Missouri and established a thriving city here on the Mississippi River. Their prophet Joseph Smith preaches publicly about traditional Christian marriage while privately practicing something entirely different. He's married to at least 30 women, possibly more than 40, including some who are already married to other men, and several who are barely teenagers, and he's commanded his closest followers to do the same, while threatening them with damnation if they reveal the practice to outsiders or even to most church members. The theological justification emerges gradually through private revelations Smith claims to receive from God. He teaches his inner circle that plural marriage, what outsiders will call polygamy, is actually the restoration of an ancient biblical practice. Abraham had multiple wives, so did Jacob and Solomon. Smith is restoring the true order of marriage that existed before corrupt Christianity abandoned it. More than that, he teaches that celestial marriage, plural marriage performed with proper priesthood authority, is essential for the highest degree of salvation. Men who refuse when commanded by the prophet are rejecting God's will. Women who refuse are denying their own exaltation. But watch how the system actually operates, and you see something more complicated than restored biblical practice. Smith approaches women with a practice technique. He tells them that an angel with a drawn sword has appeared to him, threatening to destroy him if he doesn't enter into plural marriage with them specifically. It's God's direct command, and disobedience means Smith's death and the woman's damnation. The psychological pressure is immense. If you believe Smith is a true prophet, refusing means you're personally responsible for killing God's chosen leader. You meet a young woman named Lucy Walker, 14 years old, who's living with the Smith family after her mother's death. Joseph Smith proposes plural marriage to her in 1842, giving her 24 hours to decide. She later writes about the anguish of that night. She believes he's a prophet, but the proposal horrifies her. She's a child, he's 37, and he's already married to her guardian Emma. But Smith tells her that refusal means damnation for her and death for him. The next day she accepts, becoming one of Smith's youngest plural wives. Helen Mar Kimball is even younger when her father brings her to Smith with a proposition. Helen is 14, and Smith promises her father that if the family enters into this arrangement, it will guarantee their exaltation and bind their family together for eternity. Helen later writes that she felt she had no choice. To refuse would be to reject her family's eternal salvation. She agrees, and years later reflects bitterly that she gave up her youth and chance for normal courtship because of this theology. Some of Smith's plural marriages are to women already married to other men, what historians call polyandrous marriages. Zena Huntington is pregnant with her legal husband's child when Smith marries her. Marinda Nancy Johnson Hyde is married to a Mormon apostle, serving a mission in England when Smith proposes to her. The theology gets complicated here. These women remain legally married to their first husbands but are sealed to Smith for eternity. Whether these marriages involve sexual relations is something historians still argue about, though some evidence suggests at least some of them did. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. Smith swears participants to absolute secrecy. Women who are sealed to him cannot tell their friends, their families, or even most other church members. Men who are commanded to practice plural marriage cannot discuss it openly. The secrecy serves multiple purposes. It protects the practice from external persecution. Polygamy is illegal in Illinois, and exposure would endanger the entire community. But it also protects Smith's reputation within his own church, where most members still believe he's practicing monogamy. Even his legal wife Emma often doesn't know about new sealings, and when she discovers them, the resulting confrontations are explosive. The power dynamics are stark. Smith holds absolute religious authority in this community. He claims direct revelation from God. He controls who receives temple ordinances, who gets leadership positions, whose sins are forgiven. Women and men who refuse his proposals risk not just his personal displeasure, but according to Mormon theology, their eternal salvation. It's spiritual coercion backed by the full weight of institutional authority. You discover documents showing how Smith's closest associates struggle with the principle. Brigham Young, who will later lead the Mormons to Utah, initially rejects the idea when Smith introduces it. "I felt like I had lost my last friend," Young later recalls, but eventually he accepts it and will go on to marry dozens of women himself. Heber C. Kimball weeps when commanded to offer his wife to Smith, not just to share her in polygamy, but to give her to the prophet entirely. Smith later returns her, declaring it was only a test of Kimball's faith, like Abraham being commanded to sacrifice Isaac. Other leaders never reconcile themselves to the practice. Several apostles eventually leave the church over polygamy, including some of Smith's earliest and most trusted companions. One of them, William Law, establishes a rival church and publishes a newspaper exposing Smith's plural marriages. The expose is accurate in its basic facts, but Mormons dismiss it as anti-Mormon lies. The scandal contributes directly to Smith's death. The Nauvoo City Council, dominated by Mormons, destroys Law's printing press as a public nuisance. This act leads to Smith's arrest, and while he's jailed awaiting trial, a mob storms the jail and kills him in June 1844. Smith's death doesn't end the practice, it entrenches it. Brigham Young, now leading the church, moves the Mormons to Utah Territory, where they can practice plural marriage openly, beyond effective U.S. government control. The secret practice becomes public doctrine. Young will eventually have 55 wives. Other leaders accumulate similar numbers. The theology evolves to teach that the more wives a man has, the greater his glory in the afterlife will be. But here's what gets lost in the grand theological debates: the individual women's experiences. Many accounts from Mormon women describe plural marriage as difficult at best, devastating at worst. Wives compete for their shared husband's attention, time, and resources. First wives watch their husbands court younger women. Children grow up in fractured households where their father divides his time among multiple families. Some women, particularly those married to men with many wives, barely see their husbands at all. Not every woman hated the system. Some genuinely believed in its theological importance. Some enjoyed the sisterhood with co-wives and the practical benefits of shared domestic labour. Some gained independence because their husband's attention was divided. They had marriages but also freedom. But the women who struggled had no real recourse. Leaving meant abandoning their faith, their community, often their children. The system trapped them. Historians still argue about how to characterize early Mormon polygamy. Was it systematic sexual abuse dressed as religion? Was it a genuine attempt to restore ancient practices that got complicated in execution? Was it some of both? The answer probably varies by individual case. Young teenagers pressured into marriage by prophets' commands. That looks like abuse. Adult women who chose plural marriage believing it brought spiritual blessings. That's more complicated. But the system itself created conditions where distinguishing genuine consent from coerced compliance becomes nearly impossible. The US government finally forced the issue. As Utah sought statehood, federal authorities made ending polygamy a requirement. The Edmunds-Tucker Act of 1887 disincorporated the LDS Church, seized its assets, and disenfranchised polygamous voters. Hundreds of Mormon men went to prison for practicing plural marriage. Finally, in 1890, Church President Wilford Woodruff issued a manifesto officially ending the practice, though some Mormon leaders continued performing plural marriages in secret for another 2 decades, and fundamentalist Mormon groups still practice it today. Modern Mormons struggle with this history. The LDS Church officially disavows polygamy now and excommunicates members who practice it. But it can't completely disavow the practice historically, because the men who established it, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, and others, are still revered as prophets. The Church's approach has been to acknowledge the practice, while emphasizing that it was commanded by God for specific purposes at specific times, and is not required now. Critics argue this doesn't adequately address the harm done to women who had no choice in the matter. As you leave Nauvoo, walking along the Mississippi River that witnessed this community's early growth, you think about Helen Mar Kimball, who gave up her youth for eternal salvation, and Lucy Walker, who had 24 hours to choose between obedience and damnation. You think about Emma Smith, Joseph's legal wife, who discovered her husband's plural marriages through whispers and confrontations, who felt betrayed but also trapped by her belief that he was a prophet. The theological sophistication doesn't change the human cost. Calling it celestial marriage instead of polygamy, framing it as restoration instead of innovation, claiming divine command instead of human desire. These are just the languages power uses to justify itself. The pattern holds. Give someone religious authority, and some will use it to satisfy personal desires while convinced they're serving God's purposes. The women who paid the price for that conviction haunt the historical record in their testimonies, their letters, their later regrets, reminders that every theological system, no matter how divinely inspired its leaders claim it to be, gets implemented by flawed humans making self-interested choices. You're standing in the thick jungle of Guyana in November 1978, near a settlement called Jonestown, and the air smells wrong, sweet and chemical and rotten all at once. Before you are the bodies of 909 people, including 304 children, lying in grotesque arrangements around a central pavilion. This isn't ancient history. This happened in living memory. The scandal here isn't hidden in archaeological records or medieval manuscripts. There are photographs, there are audio recordings, there are survivors who can tell you exactly how a charismatic preacher named Jim Jones transformed from a progressive civil rights activist into a paranoid cult leader who convinced nearly 1,000 people to drink cyanide-laced grape-flavored drink in the largest single loss of American civilian life until September 11th, 2001. Jim Jones starts his religious career in Indianapolis in the 1950s, and initially he seems genuinely progressive. He preaches racial integration in a segregated city, opens his church to all races, adopts children of different ethnicities, and speaks passionately about social justice. He calls his movement the People's Temple, and it attracts idealistic members who want to build a better world. Jones quotes the Bible but increasingly focuses on socialism and equality as much as traditional Christianity. For a while, he seems like exactly what he claims to be, a preacher trying to live out radical Christian love through concrete social action. But watch closely, and you see the manipulation techniques developing early. Jones stages fake healings where members pretend to be cured of cancer or paralysis. He claims to have supernatural powers, the ability to read minds, to see the future, to communicate with the dead. When members express doubts privately, Jones somehow knows about it in the next service and calls them out publicly, making it seem like he's omniscient rather than having cultivated a network of informants. He encourages members to confess their sins publicly, creating files of embarrassing information he can use for control later. You meet a woman named Deborah Layton who joined the People's Temple as an idealistic teenager. She describes how Jones gradually increased his control. First, you attended services regularly. Then you volunteered for church activities. Then you donated money. Then you signed over assets. Then you moved into communal housing. Each step seemed reasonable in isolation, but together they created total dependence. By the time you realized you were trapped, leaving meant abandoning your entire social network, your housing, often your job. Everything had become entangled with the temple. The sexual exploitation begins behind the scenes. Jones, who's married with children and preaches about communal family and reduced emphasis on sexual coupling, privately maintains sexual relationships with multiple members, both women and men. He claims that sex with him is a form of healing, a way to overcome bourgeois hang-ups about sexuality. He tells men that having sex with him will cure their latent homosexuality. He tells women that he's testing their loyalty to the cause. Some members he forces to watch while he has sex with their spouses, breaking down their sense of private relationship and individual dignity. Here's what makes Jones particularly insidious. He uses the language of progressive politics to justify abuse. He frames criticism of his behavior as evidence of internalized capitalism, racism, or sexism. If a woman objects to his sexual advances, he accuses her of being uptight and sexually repressed. If a man objects to sharing his partner, he's demonstrating possessive patriarchal attitudes. The ideology that attracted people, liberation, equality, breaking down oppressive structures, becomes the weapon used to enforce compliance with Jones's desires. The move to Guyana in 1977 represents Jones's ultimate control tactic. Faced with increasing media scrutiny and defector testimonies in California, Jones relocates the entire community to a jungle settlement in South America. He calls it creating utopia, a place where they can build socialism without capitalist interference. But removing people from their home country, from legal protections, from easy escape routes, is classic cult isolation technique. Once the People's Temple members arrive in Jonestown, they're trapped. Passports confiscated, jungle on all sides, armed guards supposedly protecting them from external threats, but actually ensuring no one leaves. Life in Jonestown reveals the gap between Jones's utopian rhetoric and dystopian reality. Members work brutal hours in agricultural labour, barely producing enough food to feed themselves. Jones, meanwhile, lives in a separate cabin with access to medicine, meat, and other luxuries denied to the general population. He broadcasts rambling speeches over loudspeakers that wake people in the middle of the night, sometimes inspirational, sometimes paranoid rants about conspiracies and enemies. He stages white nights, emergency drills where members practice revolutionary suicide, drinking what Jones says is poison, but isn't yet, to prove their loyalty. Historians still argue about Jones's mental state during this period. Was he genuinely paranoid and delusional, believing the CIA was plotting against him? Was he cynically manipulating people he knew were vulnerable? Was it some combination where his drug abuse, megalomania, and paranoia fed each other into genuine psychotic breaks mixed with calculated cruelty? The audio recordings from Jonestown's final day suggest someone who's deeply unwell but still capable of orchestrating a mass murder. That final day, November 18th, 1978, begins when Congressman Leo Ryan visits Jonestown to investigate defector allegations. Jones allows the visit but becomes increasingly agitated as some members ask to leave with Ryan. As Ryan's group heads to the airstrip, Jonestown security guards ambush them, killing Ryan and 4 others. Jones knows this act will bring consequences he can't escape. He gathers the community in the pavilion and announces that the time has come for revolutionary suicide. The audio recording that captures the next hour is one of history's most disturbing documents. You hear Jones speaking in exhausted but determined tones, calling death revolutionary suicide, protesting the conditions of an inhumane world. You hear Christine Miller, a brave woman who argues with Jones, asking why they can't go to Russia instead, why death is the only option. Jones dismisses her arguments. You hear children screaming as they're given the poisoned drink first. Cyanide mixed with sedatives and grape-flavoured Flavor Aid. You hear Jones telling people to die with dignity, to stop the crying and screaming. The logistics reveal this was murder as much as suicide. Children can't consent to death. They were murdered. Adults who drank only after watching their children die were hardly making free choices. Armed guards surrounded the pavilion. People who tried to escape were shot or forced to drink. A survivor named Stanley Clayton described seeing people who hesitated getting syringes of poison squirted into their mouths. The pile of bodies reveals people who tried to crawl away before the poison took effect. Calling it revolutionary suicide whitewashes what was actually forced mass murder, disguised with political rhetoric. Jones himself dies from a gunshot wound to the head, self-inflicted or administered by an aide. Evidence is unclear. But he doesn't drink the poison he forced on his followers. Even at the end, he maintains the leader's privilege of choosing his own death method. The aftermath forces America to grapple with uncomfortable questions. How did nearly 1,000 people end up in a jungle being controlled by an obviously deranged leader? Why didn't family members' warnings prompt earlier intervention? How did a church that started with progressive ideals curdle into totalitarian nightmare? The answers are complex. Jones was genuinely charismatic and idealistic initially. He slowly escalated control over years. He isolated people from outside information. He exploited real social problems and genuine desire for justice. And he understood that humans are capable of being manipulated if you find their vulnerabilities and press on them systematically. Here's a detail that haunts survivors. People's Temple members weren't stupid or crazy. They were teachers, nurses, social workers, educated people drawn by Jones's message of racial equality and social justice. The lesson isn't only foolish people join cults. It's that under the right circumstances, with the right manipulation techniques applied gradually, many people can be drawn into systems they'd reject if presented all at once. Start with legitimate grievances, racism, poverty, inequality, offer community and purpose. Then slowly, carefully add layers of control until turning back seems impossible. The few survivors who escaped that day carry impossible guilt. They lived while their families died. Many still struggle with the question, why didn't I see what was happening? Why didn't I stop it? How did I get drawn into something so obviously horrible? But it wasn't obvious from inside. From inside, it is idealism and community and belonging and purpose. Right up until the moment it became cyanide, and screaming children and bodies piled in the tropical heat. As you leave the site, now overgrown jungle that shows little evidence of the settlement that was here, you think about the pattern that connects Jonestown to everything else you've witnessed. Jim Jones isn't that different from the Aztec high priest who believed cutting out hearts served the sun, from Rasputin, who thought his body was sacred, from Joseph Smith, who believed God commanded plural marriage, from the medieval bishops selling indulgences. They all built systems where religious or ideological authority justified harm. The scale at Jonestown is more compressed. horror condensed into a single afternoon rather than spread across centuries. But the underlying mechanism is the same. Convince people you have access to truth they can't perceive themselves. Establish yourself as the mandatory intermediary between them and something greater. Then use that position to serve your purposes while calling it service to higher ideals. And somehow, against all evidence, people keep falling for variations on this pattern, keep granting authority to leaders who claim divine guidance, keep believing that this time, this movement, this prophet is different from all the corrupt ones that came before. You're in Dharamsala, India, in the late 1980s, though the accusations you're investigating stretch across decades and continents. This is the seat of the Tibetan government in exile, home to the Dalai Lama and thousands of Tibetan refugees who fled Chinese occupation. The atmosphere is peaceful. Prayer flags flutter in the breeze. Monks chant in monasteries. Western seekers arrive hoping to find enlightenment in Tibetan Buddhism's ancient wisdom. But beneath this serene surface, whispers circulate about certain lamas, certain teachers, certain practices that sound less like enlightenment and more like exploitation. Tibetan Buddhism includes tantric practices, advanced teachings that involve visualization, ritual, and in some cases sexual imagery used as meditation tools. In traditional Tibetan culture, these practices were carefully guarded, taught only to advanced students after years of preparation, hedged with warnings about the dangers of misuse. The sexual symbolism represents the union of wisdom and compassion, the transcendence of duality, philosophical concepts expressed through the body. In theory, tantric sexual practices involve equals working together towards spiritual realization. In practice, when transplanted to the West and stripped of cultural context, Tantra becomes a convenient justification for teachers to sleep with students while calling it Dharma transmission. You meet Western students who came to Dharamsala seeking authentic Buddhist teaching. Many are sincere spiritual seekers, educated and thoughtful, not the naive followers you might expect. They've read the texts, studied the philosophy, committed to years of practice. When a respected Lama tells them that sexual union is the next step in their spiritual development, they want to believe it's legitimate advanced teaching rather than manipulation. The power dynamics are overwhelming. This person represents enlightenment itself, claiming to guide you toward liberation. Refusing seems like ego, like attachment, like the very obstacles you're trying to overcome. One woman named June Campbell, who served as translator and secretary to a prominent Tibetan Lama in the 1970s, eventually writes a book exposing what happened. The Lama initiated a sexual relationship with her, framing it as tantric practice essential to her spiritual development. He demanded absolute secrecy. She couldn't tell anyone, including other students, because breaking tantric samaya, commitment, would allegedly bring terrible karmic consequences. For years, she continued the relationship, trying to believe it was sacred practice rather than abuse. Only after leaving his organization did she recognize the manipulation for what it was. Her account describes classic abuse dynamics wrapped in Buddhist terminology. The Lama held absolute authority over her spiritual progress. He controlled when they practiced together, what it meant, how she should interpret her experiences. He told her that any negative feelings, discomfort, shame, confusion, were signs of her own spiritual blockages rather than appropriate responses to exploitation. He emphasized that if she revealed the relationship, she'd be breaking sacred vows and creating terrible karma. She remained silent for over a decade, until writing became the only way to process the trauma. Campbell's book, Traveller in Space, creates controversy in Buddhist communities when published in 1996. Some readers thank her for exposing abuses they've also experienced or witnessed. Others accuse her of misunderstanding tantric teachings, breaking Samaya, or damaging Buddhism's reputation. The debate reveals a deep problem. Genuine tantric practice and sexual exploitation can look identical from outside, and communities often give teachers the benefit of the doubt even when accusations pile up. Historians still argue about how common these abuses are versus how much they represent exceptions to generally ethical Buddhist practice. What's certain is that multiple Tibetan lamas teaching in the West have been credibly accused of sexual misconduct with students. Sogyal Rinpoche, author of the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, faced allegations from multiple women spanning decades. Sakyong Mipham, head of Shambhala International, stepped down in 2018 after an independent investigation confirmed sexual misconduct claims. These weren't minor figures. They were major teachers with international followings and reputations for wisdom. The institutional response often mirrors other religious organizations' patterns. Initial denial, claims that accusers misunderstood cultural differences, emphasis on the teacher's positive contributions, quiet settlements, and resistance to systemic reform. Some Buddhist organizations have implemented ethics policies and accountability structures. Others maintain that Western concepts like consent don't apply to tantric relationships, that students voluntarily enter these practices, that judging teachers demonstrates misunderstanding of their enlightened perspective. Here's what makes the Buddhist version of this scandal particularly insidious. The philosophy itself can be weaponized against victims. Buddhism teaches non-attachment, seeing difficulties as opportunities for growth, recognizing that self and other are ultimately empty. A manipulative teacher can frame sexual exploitation as a teaching. Your discomfort is attachment. Your objection is ego. Your trauma is a chance to practice equanimity. The very tools meant to liberate consciousness get turned into chains that keep victims silent and compliant. You meet a man named Stephen Butterfield, who studied with Chogyam Trungpa, the Tibetan teacher who founded Naropa Institute in Colorado and attracted thousands of Western students. Trungpa was brilliant, charismatic, and utterly unconventional. He drank heavily, slept with students, behaved in ways that violated every Western expectation of how a spiritual teacher should act. His defenders said he was a crazy wisdom teacher, whose unconventional behavior was actually pointing toward enlightenment beyond conceptual frameworks. His critics said he was an alcoholic using Buddhist philosophy to justify harmful behavior. Butterfield's account describes the cognitive dissonance of studying with Trungpa. The teachings were profound, genuinely life-changing for many students. But Trungpa's personal behavior created trauma and confusion. Students who became intimate with him sometimes felt blessed, sometimes felt used, often felt both simultaneously. The community enabled his drinking and sexual activity, explaining away obvious problems as expressions of enlightened mind beyond conventional morality. When Trungpa died of cirrhosis in 1987 at age 47, students faced impossible questions. Was he enlightened despite his alcoholism because of his unconventional approach, or was enlightenment never actually there? The problem extends beyond individual teachers to systemic issues in how Tibetan Buddhism transferred to the West. Traditional Tibetan culture maintained checks on Lama behavior, community oversight, family structures, cultural expectations. When teaching moved to Western contexts, teachers gained enormous authority without corresponding accountability. Western students, lacking cultural framework to interpret teacher behavior, defaulted to assuming that anything the teacher did must be spiritually meaningful. The guru-student relationship, which in Tibet existed within broader social context, became isolated and absolute. Here's a quirky but revealing detail. Some Tibetan Buddhist centers in the West maintained separate bedrooms for visiting lamas adjacent to teaching spaces with private entrances. Staff members understood these rooms were where lamas brought students for private instruction. The architectural design literally built in space for secret sexual relationships while maintaining public appearance of celibacy. Nobody discussed it openly, but everyone knew. The physical structure of these centers embodied the cognitive split, presenting traditional monastic Buddhism publicly while accommodating non-celibate behavior privately. Not all tantric relationships were exploitative, which makes sorting genuine practice from abuse genuinely difficult. Some students did enter sexual relationships with teachers as consenting adults with full understanding. Some practicing couples used tantric techniques within committed partnerships. The existence of legitimate practice doesn't negate the exploitation, but it does complicate simple narratives. The question isn't whether tantric sexuality exists as a valid Buddhist practice. It does. The question is whether the power differential between teacher and student makes genuine consent possible, and whether secrecy serves spiritual purposes or enables abuse. The Dalai Lama himself has addressed these scandals, sometimes effectively and sometimes inadequately. He stated that teachers who engage in sexual misconduct should be exposed publicly, that students should critically examine their teachers, that Western Buddhism needs ethical guidelines. But he's also sometimes seemed to minimize the harm, suggesting that if both parties consent, then perhaps it's acceptable, that students who feel harmed might have misunderstood the teacher's intentions. His responses reveal the difficult position of criticizing fellow Tibetan lamas while trying to preserve Buddhism's reputation and maintain unity in exile. As you leave Dharamsala, walking past monasteries where monks debate philosophy and prayer wheels spin in the afternoon light, you think about June Campbell spending years believing her abuse was spiritual practice. You think about the students who faced impossible choices, remain silent and preserve their spiritual community, or speak up and be accused of breaking sacred vows. You think about how Buddhism, with its emphasis on overcoming ego and surrendering to the guru, created perfect conditions for manipulation by teachers who claimed their harmful actions expressed wisdom beyond conventional judgment. The pattern holds across traditions, grant someone spiritual authority, and some will abuse it. The specific theologies differ. Babylonian fertility goddess, Roman sacred fire, Aztec cosmic maintenance, Christian salvation, Mormon celestial marriage, Buddhist tantric transmission. But the mechanism stays constant. Convince people you're the necessary gateway to something transcendent, and you gain power over them. Use that power wisely, and you might genuinely help. Use it selfishly, and you create trauma wrapped in sacred language, abuse disguised as blessing, exploitation called enlightenment. And the victims, trained to interpret their suffering as spiritual teaching, sometimes take years or decades to recognize they were harmed rather than helped on their path. You're in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1987, watching a televangelist named Oral Roberts speak directly into the camera with tears streaming down his face. He's sitting in his prayer tower, and he's making an announcement that will become infamous. God has told him he needs to raise $8 million by March, or God will call him home, meaning kill him. The fundraising deadline creates urgency. The threat creates drama. And the money pours in from viewers who can't afford it, who sacrifice grocery money and medication money, because they believe this man has a direct line to God and God wants their cash. This is the modern megachurch era, where religious entrepreneurship meets television technology and creates money printing machines disguised as ministries. The theology underlying this movement, called prosperity gospel or word of faith, teaches that God wants believers to be wealthy, that faith itself can create material abundance, that poverty is a sign of insufficient belief. It's almost perfectly designed to extract money from poor people while enriching the preachers who promote it. And unlike ancient temple corruption that historians reconstruct from fragments, this scandal unfolds on television, in financial records, through IRS investigations that you can read today. Robert survives his fundraising deadline. The money comes in, as it almost always does when televangelists manufacture crises. But his financial manipulations are relatively modest compared to what's coming. You watch as a new generation of prosperity preachers builds empires that would make medieval bishops jealous. They fly in private jets, live in mansions, wear designer suits, and tell their followers that these luxuries prove God's blessing, and that viewers can access similar blessings by sending donations to the ministry. Kenneth Copeland operates from a massive estate in Texas, complete with private airstrip for his multiple jets. When questioned about the jets, he explains that he can't fly commercial because he can't get in a long tube with demons, his phrase for regular passengers. The jets, which cost tens of millions of dollars, are justified as ministry necessities funded by donations from people who earn minimum wage. Copeland's ministry brings in over $100 million annually, most of it untaxed because churches enjoy tax-exempt status, and most of it flowing toward lifestyle expenses that have nothing to do with feeding the poor or spreading the gospel. Creflo Dollar, yes, that's actually his name, asks his followers to fund a $65 million Gulfstream G650 jet because his current jet is old and worn out. The campaign eventually succeeds, though Dollar claims it was other churches and partners who funded it, not individual donors after public backlash. But the fact that he felt comfortable asking reveals the mentality. God wants his chosen leaders to have the best of everything, and believers should sacrifice to make that happen. You discover that prosperity gospel theology traces back to a preacher named Oral Roberts, the same one threatening to die without donations, and his mentor E.W. Kenyon, who combined New Thought metaphysics with Pentecostal Christianity. The resulting doctrine teaches that words have creative power, that speaking faith declarations can literally cause reality to conform to your desires, that God wants to bless believers financially but requires seed faith. Donations that function as investments God will multiply back to you. The manipulation is both obvious and subtle. Obviously, preachers promise that giving money to their ministries will result in financial returns, plant a seed, reap a harvest. But the subtlety lies in how they protect the theology from falsification. If you donate and receive financial blessing, the system worked. If you donate and remain poor, you didn't have enough faith, didn't give sacrificially enough, allowed doubt to block your blessing. The theology can never be wrong because it interprets all outcomes as confirmation. Historians still argue about whether prosperity preachers genuinely believe their own theology or cynically exploit believers. The answer probably varies individually and probably includes self-deception. It's psychologically easier to enjoy wealth if you convince yourself you deserve it as reward for faith, rather than admitting you're running a sophisticated scam. Kenneth Copeland probably does believe God wants him to have private jets. He's structured his entire worldview to make that belief seem spiritually sound. The scandals periodically erupt into public view when the gap between preaching and practice becomes too obvious. Jim Baker and his wife, Tammy Faye, built a television empire through PTL, Praise the Lord Club, raising hundreds of millions of dollars ostensibly for Christian programming and a Christian theme park called Heritage USA. Behind the scenes, Baker was embezzling funds, paying hush money to cover up a sexual assault, and living in absurd luxury. Gold-plated bathroom fixtures, air-conditioned dog houses, massive spending on clothes and jewellery. When it all collapsed in 1987, Baker went to prison for fraud, and the scandal rocked American Christianity. But here's what's revealing. The scandal didn't end televangelism or even significantly slow it down. Within a few years, new preachers with essentially identical theology and methods filled the vacuum. Joel Osteen took over his father's church in Houston and grew it into a mega-church meeting in a converted sports arena, preaching a softer version of prosperity gospel that emphasizes positive thinking and God's favor. His smile is more polished than Baker's, his message more carefully calibrated to avoid obvious scandal, but the underlying promise remains. God wants you blessed, and faith, expressed through church involvement and donations, opens the blessing pipeline. Joyce Meyer operates a massive ministry from Missouri, preaching empowerment and victory while living in a $10 million mansion and traveling by private jet. When investigated by Senator Chuck Grassley in 2007 for potential financial impropriety, she initially cooperated, then stopped responding, and the investigation eventually fizzled without producing meaningful accountability. The difficulty of holding megachurch preachers accountable reveals a systemic problem. Churches are tax-exempt, face minimal financial reporting requirements, and are protected by religious freedom laws that limit government oversight. The victims of prosperity gospel aren't abstract statistics. They're specific people with names and stories. You meet a woman named Melissa who donated $10,000 to a prosperity ministry after her husband died, believing the teaching that this seed would return, multiplied, and solve her financial crisis. Instead, she lost her home, her car, and nearly lost custody of her children when she couldn't provide adequate housing. The ministry she donated to never followed up, never offered help, never acknowledged that their theology had destroyed her life. When she tried to get her money back, she was told that demanding a refund demonstrated lack of faith and would guarantee God's curse rather than blessing. Or consider the elderly couple on fixed income who send monthly donations they can't afford because a televangelist tells them that only poverty-minded thinking prevents blessing. They eat cheaper food, skip medications, live in declining conditions while their donations help fund a preacher's yacht. They die believing they somehow lacked sufficient faith to unlock the prosperity promised them, never recognizing they were marks in a long con. Here's a quirky detail that reveals the operation's cynicism. Many prosperity preachers employ professional prayer hotline workers who follow scripts designed to maximize donations. If you call saying you're facing foreclosure, the script guides the worker to empathize, pray briefly, then pivot to asking for a donation that will release God's provision. The amount suggested correlates with the caller's stated financial situation, facing a $5,000 debt. The worker might suggest a $500 breakthrough seed. The more desperate your situation, the more aggressively they'll push for larger donations, framing it as the solution to your crisis rather than an exploitation of it. The theological gymnastics required to maintain prosperity gospel in the face of obvious contradictions are impressive. Jesus was poor. He told rich people to give away their wealth. He said it's easier for a camel to pass through a needle's eye than for a rich person to enter heaven. Prosperity preachers reinterpret all this. Jesus wasn't really poor. He had a treasurer, so he must have had money to manage. The rich young ruler was told to give away wealth because of his specific attachment issue, not as universal command. The camel through needle's eye saying refers to a gate in Jerusalem. Incorrect historical claim, but sounds plausible to audiences unfamiliar with actual history. The movement particularly targets minority communities, promising that faith can overcome systemic racism and economic inequality. Rather than addressing the structural issues keeping people poor, prosperity gospel tells them their poverty is their fault, evidence of insufficient faith. It's theological victim blaming that protects unjust systems by redirecting attention toward individual spiritual failure rather than collective political action. As you leave the latest megachurch, this one meeting in a converted warehouse with elaborate production values, fog machines, and a rock star-style preacher, you think about how the specific methods change but the pattern persists. The Babylonian priests didn't have television, but they had monopoly on divine communication. The medieval bishops didn't have private jets, but they had castles and political power. The prosperity preachers aren't that different from Johann Tetzel selling indulgences. Both promise that giving money to religious authorities opens spiritual blessings. Both target desperate people's fears and hopes. Both enrich themselves while claiming to serve God. The language updates from Latin to English, from parchment to television, from cathedral to megachurch, but the transaction remains constant. Your money for their promise of divine favour. And somehow, despite centuries of exposed religious financial scandals, people keep believing that this time, this preacher, this ministry, is genuinely different from all the corrupt ones that came before. You're sitting in a courtroom in Boston in 2002, watching Cardinal Bernard Law testify about what he knew and when he knew it. The Catholic Church is facing the largest institutional scandal in its modern history, the systematic sexual abuse of children by priests, and more damningly, the institutional cover-up that protected predators and enabled decades of continued abuse. This isn't about individual bad actors anymore. This is about a system that chose institutional preservation over child safety, that transferred known abusers to new parishes where they found new victims, that threatened victims and their families into silence, that paid settlements with confidentiality, clauses that kept the public from knowing the scope of the crisis. The Boston Globe Spotlight team has just published their investigation, revealing that Cardinal Law knew about abusive priests and simply moved them to different parishes rather than reporting them to police or removing them from ministry. Father John Geoghegan alone abused over 130 children across multiple parishes over 3 decades. The church knew. Documents prove that church officials knew, and they prioritize protecting the church's reputation over protecting children. Law eventually resigns and is reassigned to a prestigious position in Rome, never facing criminal prosecution. The pattern of protect the institution, blame the victim, and ensure no real consequences could be lifted directly from ancient temples, just with modern PR firms and legal teams added. But the scandal extends far beyond Boston. As you trace the investigation's ripple effects, similar patterns emerge globally. In Ireland, the Ryan Report documents decades of child abuse in Catholic institutions, schools, orphanages, reform schools, where priests, brothers and nuns physically, sexually and emotionally abused thousands of children. The Irish government's investigation reveals that church authorities knew about the abuse and covered it up systematically. In Australia, the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse finds that 7% of Australian Catholic priests were accused of abuse between 1950 and 2010. with some dioceses having accusation rates over 15%. The Pennsylvania grand jury report released in 2018 identifies over 300 predator priests and more than 1,000 child victims across 6 decades in just that one state. The report's most chilling finding isn't the abuse itself, horrible as that is, but the institutional response. Bishops kept secret archives documenting abuse allegations. They used euphemisms in files. Priests who raped children were described as having boundary issues or being too affectionate. They transferred abusers strategically, sometimes giving them fresh assignments in parishes with youth programs, essentially providing new hunting grounds. You meet survivors who describe reporting their abuse to church authorities as teenagers, only to be told they were lying, that they'd tempted the priest, that speaking publicly would damage their family's reputations and the church's mission. One man describes telling his pastor that a priest was molesting him, and the pastor responded by praying with him, not for protection from the abuser, but for forgiveness for the impure thoughts that led him to make such accusations. The theological weaponry deployed against victims is sophisticated. You're attacking Christ's bride, the church. You're giving scandal. You're letting Satan divide the faithful. You're demonstrating pride by refusing to forgive and forget. Historians still argue about the causes of this crisis. Some point to mandatory celibacy, suggesting that requiring priests not to marry creates dysfunction and attracts men with problematic sexual development. Others note that abuse rates in other institutions, schools, youth organizations, families, are comparable to or higher than the church's rates, suggesting that the unique scandal is the cover-up rather than the prevalence. But what's undeniable is that the church's hierarchical structure, its culture of obedience and secrecy, its emphasis on institutional loyalty above individual welfare, created perfect conditions for abuse to flourish and remain hidden. The cover-up methods are remarkably consistent across continents and decades. Bishops receive abuse allegations and tell the victim's family that the matter will be handled internally. The priest is sent to church-run treatment facilities, not mental hospitals or legal authorities, but facilities operated by and for the church. After treatment, often lasting just a few months, the priest is declared rehabilitated and reassigned. The new parish isn't told about the history. Victims are pressured or paid to sign non-disclosure agreements. Files are kept in secret archives, sometimes literally called secret archives, that even other church officials can't access. In Belgium, investigators find that the church maintained files in a building separate from the main diocesan offices, files that documented abuse but were never shared with civil authorities. When police raid these offices in 2010, they literally uncover boxes of files describing hundreds of abuse cases spanning decades. The church's defense, that they were handling the matter through canon law rather than civil law, reveals the problem. The church considered itself an entity above or separate from normal legal accountability, a sovereign state within the state with its own judicial system that prioritized internal discipline over victim protection. You discover that the Vatican itself, under multiple popes, knew about the global abuse crisis and failed to act decisively. Pope John Paul II maintained personal friendships with several priests later revealed to be serial abusers, including Father Martial Maciel, founder of the Legion of Christ, who abused dozens of seminarians and fathered multiple children while maintaining his position until after John Paul's death. Pope Benedict XVI, before becoming pope, headed the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, which handled abuse cases and signed documents ordering bishops to maintain secrecy about investigations. Pope Francis has made stronger statements about accountability, but continues to face criticism for insufficient action and for maintaining bishops who protected abusers. Here's what makes the Catholic scandal particularly significant in this larger history of temple corruption. The betrayal of trust is magnified by the Church's moral claims. The Catholic Church doesn't just claim to be one religious option among many. It claims to be the earthly representative of Christ, the keeper of moral truth, the institution founded by God to guide humanity to salvation. When that institution systematically protects child rapists while preaching sexual morality to others, the hypocrisy is staggering. It's the Vestal Virgin scandal multiplied by thousands, the Rasputin abuse with institutional backing, the megachurch corruption with deeper theological claims. The financial cost reveals the scale of the crisis. By 2020, the Catholic Church in the United States alone has paid over $4 billion in settlements to abuse survivors. Multiple dioceses have filed for bankruptcy to limit their financial exposure. Insurance companies now exclude abuse coverage from church policies. The money comes from parish donations, property sales, endowments, ultimately from ordinary Catholics who trusted church leadership and now bear the financial burden of institutional failures. But focus on the survivors, and money becomes almost beside the point. You meet a man named Phil Saviano who was abused by a priest as a teenager and spent decades trying to get the church to acknowledge what happened. He testified before grand juries, spoke to journalists, contacted church officials at every level. For years he was dismissed, ignored, or actively silenced. Only when the Boston Globe investigation gave him a platform did the church finally acknowledge his abuse. But acknowledgement doesn't undo the trauma. The years of therapy, the relationship difficulties, the spiritual crisis of reconciling childhood Catholic faith with adult knowledge of institutional betrayal. Or consider the Irish survivors of industrial schools, Catholic institutions that housed thousands of poor or orphan children. They describe environments of constant physical abuse, emotional cruelty and sexual violation, all within institutions supposedly teaching Christian charity. One woman recounts being raped repeatedly by a priest, while nuns told her she was sinful and deserved punishment. The cognitive damage of being told God condemns you, while his representatives abuse you, is profound. Many survivors leave not just Catholicism, but any religious faith, unable to separate the trauma from the theology. Here's a detail that connects this modern scandal to ancient patterns. Catholic canon law, the Church's internal legal system, developed from Roman law and medieval tradition. For centuries it served to keep church matters internal, to maintain the Church's position as an entity with its own sovereignty and judicial processes. When applied to property disputes or theological questions, this system has some logic. When applied to child rape, it becomes a mechanism for avoiding accountability. The same structural feature that protected the Church from external interference through centuries of political upheaval now protects predators from legal consequences. The system built to preserve the institution becomes the system that enables abuse. Other religious traditions face similar scandals. Orthodox Judaism's handling of abuse in ultra-Orthodox communities, Southern Baptist Church's patterns of pastoral abuse and congregation cover-ups, Jehovah's Witnesses' internal judicial processes that silence victims. The patterns repeat: hierarchical authority structures, theological emphasis on obedience, institutional investment in reputation preservation, treatment of exposure as attack on faith itself. The Catholic Church's scandal is largest in scope and best documented, but the dynamics appear wherever religious institutions prioritize themselves over the vulnerable people they claim to serve. As you leave the courthouse where yet another abuse case is being settled, you think about the pattern that runs through this entire history. The Mesopotamian temple priestess who couldn't refuse because the gods demanded it. The Vestal virgin accused without evidence because Rome needed a scapegoat. The Devadasi dedicated as a child with no choice. The Mormon girl given 24 hours to accept plural marriage or face damnation. The Jonestown children forced to drink poison. The Buddhist student told her discomfort was ego. The prosperity gospel donor who sacrificed her last money believing God required it. And now the Catholic child told by his abuser that this was God's love, then told by bishops that reporting it would damage God's church. You're standing in Wittenberg again, but this time it's 2017, exactly 500 years after Martin Luther's theses sparked the Reformation. The symbolic significance isn't lost on anyone. Half a millennium ago, exposure of church corruption fractured Christianity. Today, exposure of corruption threatens religious institutions across traditions. But something is different now. The victims aren't silent anymore. The documents aren't locked in secret archives anymore. The internet has made information democratization possible in ways that would have seemed miraculous to medieval reformers. And slowly, painfully, religious institutions are being forced to reckon with their failures. The Me Too movement of 2017-2018 creates space for religious abuse survivors to speak publicly in unprecedented numbers. The Church2 hashtag fills with testimonies from Protestant megachurch members describing pastoral abuse. The patterns are dismayingly familiar. Charismatic leaders using spiritual authority to manipulate followers into sexual relationships. Institutions protecting powerful men rather than vulnerable congregants. Victims blamed for tempting godly leaders into sin. Bill Hybels, founder of Willow Creek Community Church, one of America's most influential megachurches, resigns in 2018 after multiple women accuse him of sexual misconduct spanning decades. The church initially defends him, attacks his accusers, then gradually admits the allegations have credibility. Ravi Zacharias, celebrated Christian apologist, dies in 2020 with his reputation largely intact. Months later, an independent investigation reveals he sexually abused multiple women who worked at spas he owned, using his fame and spiritual authority to manipulate them into silence. The report describes a pattern of predation lasting years, enabled by ministry staff who helped hide his activities. The revelation devastates thousands who considered Zacharias a spiritual hero, who read his books, attended his lectures, trusted his moral authority. His ministry dismantles, his books are pulled from circulation, but the damage to his victims and to faith itself can't be undone by posthumous exposure. You watch as institutions begin implementing reforms, background checks, mandatory reporting training, abuse prevention policies, independent investigation mechanisms. The Catholic Church establishes review boards, though critics note these boards often lack real independence and authority. Protestant denominations create registries of credibly accused ministers, though enforcement remains spotty. Buddhist centers develop ethics codes for teachers, though traditionalists argue Western concepts of consent don't apply to Eastern practices. The reforms are genuine but incomplete, reactive rather than proactive, often implemented only after scandal forces action. Here's what gives cautious hope. Survivor voices are now centering the conversation in ways that were impossible even 20 years ago. Organizations like SNAP, Survivors, network of those abused by priests, provide support and advocacy. Books like The Body Keeps the Score help people understand religious trauma as legitimate psychological injury. therapy approaches specifically addressing religious abuse develop. Survivors who were isolated and blamed now find communities that believe them, validate their experiences and support their healing. The legal landscape shifts too. Statute of limitations reforms in multiple states allow survivors to sue over abuse that occurred decades ago. The Child Victims Act in New York opens a temporary window for filing claims regardless of when the abuse happened, leading to thousands of lawsuits that finally hold institutions accountable. Insurance companies, facing massive payouts, begin demanding better safeguarding practices from religious organizations. Financial consequences, when legal and moral arguments fail, sometimes motivate institutional change. But you also see resistance to reform. Conservative religious communities argue that accountability measures represent secular attack on religious freedom. Some defend hierarchical authority structures as biblically mandated, unchangeable regardless of abuse risks. Others claim that dwelling on past failures damages current ministry and prevents focus on spreading the gospel. The resistance isn't universal, but it's substantial enough to slow reform and protect some institutions from meaningful change. Historians watching this moment still argue about whether we're witnessing genuine transformation or just another cycle of scandal, exposure, reform complacency that repeats throughout religious history. The optimistic reading suggests that technology and cultural shifts make sustained cover-up increasingly impossible, that institutions must reform or become irrelevant. The pessimistic reading notes that humans have short memories, that new scandals keep emerging even in supposedly reformed institutions, that the structural features enabling abuse, hierarchy, spiritual authority, institutional self-interest, remain largely unchanged. You meet young people who've left religious traditions entirely, not because they stopped believing in God, but because they can't trust religious institutions anymore. They've watched respected leaders exposed as abusers, seen churches protect predators, experience personally how spiritual language weaponizes against victims. Some find faith outside institutional religion, spiritual but not religious as the phrase goes. Others abandon faith altogether, deciding that the corruption isn't incidental but inherent to systems that claim special access to divine truth. Yet you also meet reformers working within traditions, people who believe their religions can be redeemed, that the abuses represent betrayals of rather than expressions of core teachings. These reformers advocate for transparency, accountability, victim-centered policies, and dismantling the power structures that enabled abuse. They face opposition from traditionalists but also gain support from members demanding their institutions live up to their stated values. The outcome remains uncertain. Can hierarchical religious institutions fundamentally reform? Or does the structure itself inevitably generate corruption? Here's a quirky but significant detail. Insurance underwriters now treat religious institutions as high-risk clients for liability purposes. The actuarial data is clear. Churches, temples, and religious organizations face elevated abuse and fraud risks compared to secular non-profits. This market-based assessment, driven purely by financial calculation rather than theological judgment, confirms what the historical record shows. Religious authority creates conditions where exploitation flourishes. The secular world has recognized what believers often resist acknowledging. The digital age creates both opportunities and challenges for religious institutions. On one hand, social media lets survivors share stories and find support, makes cover-ups harder, enables rapid information spread that would have taken generations in earlier eras. On the other hand, religious organizations use the same technology to shape narratives, attack critics, and maintain influence despite scandals. The Catholic Church operates sophisticated media operations. Megachurch pastors command enormous social media followings. The technological playing field has leveled, but power imbalances remain. As you consider this entire journey, from Mesopotamian temples to modern megachurches, from sacred prostitution to prosperity gospel, from Vestal Virgin trials to Catholic abuse scandals, patterns emerge that transcend specific traditions. Religious authority creates power. Power creates opportunity for exploitation. Exploitation wrapped in sacred language becomes harder to recognize and challenge. Institutions prioritize self-preservation over justice. Victims get blamed, silenced, or dismissed. And somehow, despite endless repetition of this pattern, humans keep granting religious figures authority over their lives, their bodies, their resources, their children. But you also see change happening slowly and incompletely, but genuinely. Do you remember the Vestal Virgins buried alive based on rumours, with no voice to defend themselves? Do you remember the Deva daisies dedicated as children with no choice in their futures? Do you remember the Mormon girls given hours to decide their eternal fate? Do you remember Jonestown's children forced to drink poison? Those victims had almost no power, almost no voice, almost no hope that anyone would hold their abusers accountable. Today's survivors face enormous obstacles, but they have something their historical counterparts didn't. Platforms to speak, communities that believe them, legal systems that sometimes deliver justice, cultural movements that validate rather than blame them. The work is far from complete. Abusers still hide in religious communities. Institutions still prioritize reputation over accountability. Theology still weaponizes against victims. But the trajectory, viewed across centuries, bends toward justice more than it did when temple priests controlled all information, when religious leaders were above legal accountability, when victims had nowhere to turn. The battle isn't won, but it's finally being fought in ways that weren't possible when the powerful controlled both the earthly institutions and the claimed access to divine authority. As this long night's journey through temple scandals draws toward close, you stand at a crossroads. One path leads back into comfortable belief that your tradition, your leaders, your institution are exceptions to the historical pattern, that corruption was always somewhere else, some other time, some other faith. The other path accepts the uncomfortable truth that no tradition is immune, that religious authority will always attract some people who exploit it, that vigilance and accountability aren't attacks on faith but essential protections for faith's integrity. The choice isn't whether to believe in the sacred. That's personal and profound. The choice is whether to trust that the sacred needs protection through secrecy and unquestioned authority, or whether genuine holiness can survive, even thrive, under the light of transparency, challenge, and accountability. The temples still stand, some ancient ruins, some modern buildings with parking lots and sound systems. The scandals continue, new ones emerging as you read this, some already making headlines, others still hidden, waiting for brave survivors to speak and believing communities to listen. The patterns persist because human nature persists, because power corrupts regardless of how much incense surrounds it, because calling something sacred doesn't make it immune to human selfishness and cruelty. But resistance persists too. Reformers, survivors, believers who refuse to choose between faith and justice, who insist their traditions can be better, who work to ensure that future generations inherit religions purified by honesty rather than protected by denial. The night is ending, morning light touches the horizon, and you carry with you not cynicism that makes all faith impossible, but wisdom that makes mature faith possible. The understanding that humans, even humans claiming divine authority, remain human. That understanding doesn't destroy the sacred, it protects it from those who would exploit it. It honors the genuine seekers, the sincere believers, the true teachers, by refusing to let predators hide behind religious authority anymore. The temples may house both the holy and the corrupt, but knowing the difference, insisting on the difference, fighting for the difference, that might be the most sacred work of all. The soft glow of dawn filters through your window now, and your breathing has slowed to match the gentle rhythm of morning birds beginning their songs. You've walked through millennia tonight, witnessed humanity at its worst dressed in sacred garments, but also seen the slow, painful progress toward accountability and truth. Let this knowledge settle gently in your mind, not as fuel for anger that keeps you awake, but as wisdom that helps you navigate the world more carefully, more compassionately, with eyes open to both human potential for good and capacity for harm. The stories are told now, the patterns revealed, the victims remembered, and you can rest knowing that awareness itself is a kind of resistance. That understanding history helps prevent its repetition, that your discernment protects both you and those you care about from those who would exploit faith for selfish purposes. Sleep now with the comfort of knowing that truth, however difficult, is ultimately more healing than convenient fiction. The temples stand, but so do you, informed, aware, capable of honouring the sacred while refusing to grant authority to those unworthy of trust. Close your eyes. Let the weight of these stories drift away like smoke from ancient altars. Tomorrow brings new chances to build communities of genuine faith, transparent leadership, and accountable love. But tonight, simply rest. The journey is complete. The lessons are learned, and morning will bring its own light, its own revelations, its own opportunities to choose wisdom over naivety, justice over comfort, truth over convenient belief. Sweet dreams.